Before language had a written form, before the first alphabet was scratched into wet clay or carved with a bronze stylus into stone, human beings were already asking each other questions they did not intend to answer. Picture a fire, low and orange, sometime in the deep past, the kind of past that has no year attached to it because no one was counting yet. Around that fire sit people whose names are lost, whose faces we will never reconstruct, whose bones have long since returned to the earth. One of them leans forward, the firelight catching the lines around their eyes, and says something like this: "What has a voice but no mouth? What runs but has no legs? What can fill a room but takes up no space?" And the others sit there in the flickering dark, turning the question over, feeling its edges, trying to pry it open like a shell. Nobody knows when the first riddle was asked. Nobody can know, because the first riddle almost certainly predated writing by thousands of years, which means it lived and died in the air between two people, and was either remembered or forgotten before anyone thought to put it down. What we do know is that by the time civilizations began keeping records, riddles were already ancient. They appear in the oldest surviving literature on Earth. They show up in Sumerian tablets, dating back more than 4,000 years, scratched into clay in cuneiform script, little puzzles about houses and rivers and the bodies of the dead. They appear in the Rig Veda, the sacred hymns of early Hinduism, composed perhaps 3,500 years ago, where cosmic riddles are woven into prayers and the act of solving them is treated as a form of worship. They surface in the oldest layers of Chinese philosophy, in the folk traditions of sub-Saharan Africa, in the oral poetry of pre-Islamic Arabia. Everywhere you look in the human record, as far back as the record goes, people were doing this strange, unnecessary, entirely wonderful thing, wrapping the truth in a disguise and daring each other to unwrap it. Why? What possible purpose could a riddle serve for people who had quite enough real problems to solve, people fighting drought and famine and disease and the constant threat of violence from neighboring tribes? The answer, perhaps, is that a riddle is the one kind of problem that is safe. The drought will kill you if you cannot solve it. The famine will take your children. But the riddle only takes your pride, and only for a moment, and then it gives you something back. The small, private pleasure of seeing the world rearranged, of realizing that a thing you thought you understood had a second meaning hiding behind the first. A riddle teaches you that the world is not as fixed as it appears. It trains the mind to look sideways, to expect the unexpected, to hold two contradictory ideas in your head at once and feel not confusion but delight. And in the oldest cultures, this was not merely entertainment. It was considered a kind of wisdom. The person who could solve riddles was the person who could see what others missed, and the person who could pose them was the person who understood the strangeness of existence well enough to put it into words. So let us begin where the ancient world itself began, at least in the Western imagination, on a rocky hillside outside the city of Thebes, where the most famous riddle ever asked was waiting for the one person clever enough to answer it and foolish enough not to realize what the answer would cost him. The road to Thebes was empty. It had been empty for weeks, perhaps months, because travelers had stopped using it. Word travels fast when people start dying, faster still when the manner of death is unusual, and the deaths on the road to Thebes were unusual indeed. Merchants, who had once driven their carts along the dusty track to sell olives and wine in the city's markets, now took routes that added days to their journeys rather than risk the pass. Shepherds who had grazed their flocks on the hillside above the road had moved to distant valleys. Even soldiers, men trained for violence and accustomed to danger, refused to patrol the area after dark, because something had taken up residence on the rocks above the road, something that was not quite animal and not quite human, something that asked questions. The Sphinx had the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the face of a woman. She had arrived without warning, descending from the sky, some said, or crawling up from the earth, and she had chosen her perch with the deliberate care of a predator selecting a hunting ground. The rocks above the road gave her a clear view of anyone approaching from either direction, and the narrow pass below meant that no traveler could avoid her. She did not attack without warning, which somehow made her more terrifying than any ordinary beast. She waited, patient and still, her great leonine body stretched across the warm stone, her wings folded against her flanks, her human eyes watching the road with an expression that was almost kind. And when a traveler appeared below, she would unfurl herself, glide down to block the path and speak. Her voice, the poets tell us, was beautiful. That is the detail that stays with you, the awful beauty of her voice, clear and musical, the voice of a woman who might have sung lullabies in another life. And with that voice, she would pose her riddle, always the same riddle, and she would wait with what appeared to be genuine curiosity for the answer. The traveler would stand there, heart hammering, sweat cooling on their skin, and try to think. Most of them could not. Fear does terrible things to the mind, and the Sphinx knew this. She was counting on it. When the answer came back wrong, as it always did, she killed. Some versions say she strangled them. Others say she devoured them whole. The bones piled up at the base of the rocks, white and scattered, the only monument the dead would ever receive. The city of Thebes was paralyzed. Its king, Laius, was already dead, murdered by an unknown assailant at a crossroads far from the city, and with no king and no safe roads, Thebes was slowly suffocating. Creon, the queen's brother, had assumed temporary control, and in desperation, he made a proclamation. Whoever could defeat the Sphinx and free the city would be given the throne and the hand of Queen Jocasta in marriage. It was an extraordinary offer, a kingdom and a queen for the price of a single correct answer, and it tells you everything about how desperate Thebes had become. The man who answered the call was a stranger, a young man with a limp and a sharp mind, and a past he did not fully understand. His name was Oedipus, and he had been raised in Corinth by King Polybus and Queen Merope, whom he believed to be his true parents. He had left Corinth in a hurry, fleeing a prophecy that said he would kill his father and marry his mother, a prophecy so horrifying that he had decided never to return home rather than risk its fulfillment. He did not know, could not have known, that the prophecy had already begun to come true. The man he had killed at a crossroads days earlier, in a dispute over the right of way, had been Laius, his father, the real one. Oedipus approached the Sphinx on the road to Thebes with the confidence of a man who has nothing left to lose. He had abandoned his home, killed a stranger in anger, and walked for days through unfamiliar country. Fear had lost its grip on him somewhere along the way, and what remained was a cold, clear intelligence, the kind that does its best work when everything else has been stripped away. The Sphinx descended from her rocks and regarded him. Perhaps she noticed something different about this one, some quality in his bearing that the others had lacked. Perhaps she did not. She posed her riddle, and her beautiful voice carried the words across the empty hillside like a song. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? Oedipus looked at her. He did not panic. He did not stammer or beg for more time. He stood in the road with the dust settling around his sandals, and he thought about it, really thought about it, and the answer came to him not as a flash of inspiration, but as a slow, sad recognition. Because the answer was not a clever trick. The answer was the most ordinary thing in the world. Man, he said. A human being crawls on 4 limbs as an infant, walks upright on 2 legs in the prime of life, and uses a cane as a 3rd leg in old age. The Sphinx stared at him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, according to the oldest versions of the story, she threw herself from the rocks and died. Other versions say she devoured herself, or that she simply vanished, dissolving into the air like smoke. But in every version, the result is the same. The riddle was answered, the Sphinx was destroyed, and the road to Thebes was open again. Oedipus entered the city as a hero. He was given the crown and the queen, just as Creon had promised, and for a time, a brief golden time, he ruled well and was loved. He had 4 children with Jocasta. The city prospered. The bones on the hillside were gathered and buried. And Oedipus, the man who had solved the riddle of the Sphinx, did not for years and years solve the riddle of himself. When the truth finally emerged, when plague struck Thebes and the oracle declared that the city harbored the murderer of its former king, and Oedipus, the brilliant, relentless investigator, tracked the crime back through witness after witness until it led inevitably, sickeningly to himself. The man who had understood the entire arc of human life in a single answer on a dusty road could not bear to look at the life he had actually lived. Jocasta hanged herself. Oedipus took the pins from her dress and drove them into his own eyes, choosing blindness over sight, because some truths, once seen, cannot be unseen. The riddle of the Sphinx endures not because it is difficult. It is, by modern standards, almost embarrassingly simple. A child could solve it. It endures because of what happened to the man who solved it, because of the terrible irony woven into its fabric. The riddle describes the entire span of a human life, from helpless infancy to the frailty of old age. And the man who understood that span so clearly could not see the shape of his own. He knew what a human being was in the abstract, but he did not know who he was in particular. He could read the riddle of the species, but not the riddle of the self. And that is the deepest riddle the story has to offer, the one the Sphinx never asked and Oedipus never answered. Is it possible to understand everything about humanity and still understand nothing about yourself? Let that one settle. Let it sit with you in the dark like a stone in your hand, smooth and heavy and impossible to put down. Now consider a different world, a different century, a different kind of man standing in front of a different kind of audience, asking a question that should never have been asked at all. The story comes from the book of Judges, and the man at its center is Samson, the last of the great judges of Israel, a figure of extraordinary physical power and equally extraordinary recklessness. Samson was a Nazirite, consecrated to God before his birth, bound by vows that included never cutting his hair, never touching a corpse, and never drinking wine. He broke every one of these vows at one time or another, because Samson was not a man who lived by rules, not even divine ones. He was a force of nature, impulsive, passionate, violent, capable of killing 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey, and equally capable of falling in love with precisely the wrong woman at precisely the wrong time. The riddle comes early in his story, during his wedding feast. Samson had fallen in love with a Philistine woman from the town of Timnah, a choice that horrified his parents because the Philistines were the enemies of Israel, occupiers of the land, worshippers of foreign gods. But Samson wanted what he wanted, and what Samson wanted, Samson took. The wedding was arranged, and a great feast was prepared, as was the custom, lasting 7 days. On the road to Timnah for the feast, Samson had encountered a young lion. The Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, the scripture says, and he tore the lion apart with his bare hands as easily as one might tear a young goat. He told no one about this, not his parents, not his bride. Sometime later, passing the same spot on the road, he noticed that a swarm of bees had made their hive in the carcass of the dead lion, and honey had collected in the ribcage. He scooped the honey out with his hands and ate it as he walked, again telling no one what he had found or where he had found it. At the wedding feast, surrounded by 30 Philistine companions assigned to attend him, Samson proposed a wager. If they could solve his riddle within the 7 days of the feast, he would give each of them a set of fine linen garments and a change of clothing. If they could not, they would owe the same to him. The stakes were significant but not ruinous. This was meant to be entertainment, a game to pass the long evenings of celebration. The Philistines agreed eagerly, and Samson spoke his riddle. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. The riddle is, by any fair standard, unsolvable, and that is precisely the point. Unlike the Sphinx's riddle, which was a genuine test of wisdom, an honest question with a logical answer, Samson's riddle was a cheat. It was not based on universal experience or shared knowledge. It was based on a private event that only Samson had witnessed, the lion he had killed and the honey the bees had made in its corpse. No amount of cleverness could lead the Philistines to the correct answer, because the answer depended on information they could not possibly possess. The riddle was, in essence, a locked room with no key, a game rigged from the start. The Philistines spent 3 days trying to solve it. They argued and speculated and proposed answers that Samson dismissed with a smile. By the 4th day, frustration had curdled into something darker. They approached Samson's bride in private and delivered a threat that was not subtle. "Get the answer from your husband, or we will burn your father's house to the ground with your entire family inside." The bride wept. She went to Samson and pleaded with him, accusing him of not truly loving her because he had posed a riddle to her countrymen that he would not explain to her. For 3 days she wept and pressed him, and Samson, who could resist an army but could not resist tears, finally told her. He told her about the lion and the honey, the secret he had kept from everyone, and she immediately passed the answer to the Philistines. On the 7th day, just before sunset, just before the deadline expired, the Philistines came to Samson with their answer. "What is sweeter than honey?" they said. "And what is stronger than a lion?" Samson knew instantly what had happened. His face went hard, and his reply was bitter and cutting. "If you had not plowed with my heifer," he said, "you would not have solved my riddle." The insult was deliberate, the anger real, and what followed was violence. Samson went down to Ashkelon, killed 30 Philistine men, stripped them of their garments, and brought the clothing back to pay his debt. Then he abandoned his bride and returned to his father's house, burning with rage. His wife was given to another man. When Samson learned of it, he tied torches to the tails of 300 foxes and set them loose in the Philistine grain fields, burning the harvest to nothing. The Philistines retaliated by burning his wife and her father alive, the very fate they had threatened her with, completing a circle of violence that began with a riddle and ended in ash. And so it went, escalation after escalation, until Samson's story reached its own terrible conclusion in the temple of Dagon, where, blind and in chains, he pulled the pillars down and killed more in his death than he had killed in his life. Samson's riddle is important not because it is clever, but because it is unfair, and because its unfairness is the engine of everything that follows. A fair riddle invites thought. An unfair riddle invites resentment. And resentment, as the story demonstrates with ruthless efficiency, invites destruction. The riddle was never really about honey or lions. It was about power, about a man who wanted to prove he was smarter than the people around him and chose a method that guaranteed he would win, not realizing that a game you can only win by cheating is a game you have already lost. Think about that for a moment. A rigged riddle, a question designed so that only the asker knows the answer. How many conversations in your own life have felt like that? Arguments where the other person already knew what they wanted to hear, tests where the criteria were invisible, puzzles where the missing piece was hidden in someone else's pocket. Samson's riddle is the ancestor of every loaded question, every trick exam, every interview designed to make the candidate fail. It is a warning dressed as a story, and the warning is this: be careful what you ask, because the answer might destroy you before it destroys anyone else. Let those two riddles sit beside each other now, the one that was fair and the one that was not, the one that tested wisdom and the one that tested loyalty, the one whose solver was undone by knowledge and the one whose poser was undone by love. They are separated by centuries, by cultures, by the entire width of the ancient Mediterranean, and yet they are asking the same question underneath their surfaces. What happens to the person who stands at the center of a riddle? What does it cost to be the one who knows? Now let the centuries turn. Let the ancient world grow old and fall. Let Rome rise and crumble and scatter its stones across 1,000 fields. Let the long, slow darkness of the early medieval period settle over northern Europe, a darkness that was never quite as dark as we have been taught to believe, because even in the coldest centuries, even in the most remote corners of the known world, people were still writing, still thinking, still asking questions they did not intend to answer. Sometime in the second half of the 10th century, in a monastery in the south of England, perhaps Exeter, perhaps somewhere nearby, a scribe sat down with a quill and a pot of ink and began copying a collection of poems, prayers, elegies, and riddles into a single large codex. The book would survive fire, theft, neglect, and nearly 1,000 years of English weather. It would be stabbed, apparently used as a cutting board at some point, and scorched, its back pages darkened and damaged by what appears to have been a burning brand laid carelessly on its cover. It would pass through the hands of monks, nobles, and antiquarians before finally coming to rest in the library of Exeter Cathedral, where it remains today. The largest surviving collection of Old English poetry in existence. We call it the Exeter Book. Among its treasures are 95 riddles, and they are unlike anything else in the medieval literary record. They are playful where you would expect solemnity. They are earthy where you would expect piety. They are, in places, startlingly bawdy, filled with double meanings that would make a modern reader blush and that certainly made their medieval audience roar with laughter. And they are, many of them, genuinely beautiful, shot through with a melancholy awareness of the world's fragility that sits alongside the humor-like shadow sits alongside light. The riddles are written in Old English, the language of Beowulf, a tongue so different from modern English that it reads almost like a foreign language. They are composed in the alliterative verse form that was standard for Anglo-Saxon poetry, each line divided by a caesura, each half-line carrying at least one stressed syllable, beginning with the same consonant sound. The effect, when read aloud, is hypnotic, a drumbeat of repeated sounds that pulls the listener forward like a current. Consider one of the most famous, riddle number 25. In the original Old English, it begins with a description of a creature that is wonderful, a thing that fights and serves, that moves across the land and is useful to men. The answer, most scholars agree, is an onion. But the riddler describes the onion as a warrior, something that brings tears to the eyes of anyone who tries to fight it, something that stands firm in its bed and defends itself against all comers. The onion becomes, in the riddler's hands, a tiny hero, a vegetable knight, and the act of peeling it becomes a miniature battle, complete with weeping casualties. The humor is unmistakable, but so is the craft. The riddler has seen something in an ordinary kitchen vegetable that no one else has bothered to see, and by putting it into verse, has made that small, absurd insight permanent. Or consider riddle number 47, which describes a creature, a bookworm, a moth that eats the pages of a manuscript. The riddle marvels at the strangeness of this. A small insect consuming the words of a wise man, swallowing songs and stories and the foundations of knowledge, and yet growing no wiser for having eaten them. The moth devours wisdom and remains a moth. The riddle is funny, yes, a tiny joke about a bug with literary pretensions, but it is also quietly devastating, because the riddle is really about the difference between consuming knowledge and understanding it, between holding words in your mouth and holding them in your mind. The bookworm eats the poem but does not hear it. The bookworm swallows the song but cannot sing. And if you have ever read something brilliant and felt it pass through you without leaving a mark, if you have ever sat in a lecture or listened to a sermon and retained nothing, then you are, the riddle gently suggests, the bookworm. You are the moth at the feast. The Exeter Book riddles do not have verified answers. The solutions were never written down, or, if they were recorded separately and have not survived. This means that scholars have been arguing about the correct answers for over a century, and in some cases the arguments show no signs of resolution. Riddle number 60, for example, has been interpreted as a reed pen, a drinking vessel, a rune staff, and a phallus, and credible arguments have been made for all four. The ambiguity is not a flaw. It may well be the point. A riddle whose answer is absolutely certain is a riddle that has been used up, emptied out, reduced to a fact. A riddle whose answer is still debated 1,000 years after it was written is a riddle that is still alive, still doing its work, still forcing the reader to look at the world and wonder. The monks and scribes who composed these riddles were not frivolous men. They lived in an age of faith and fear, of Viking raids and early death, of long winters and uncertain harvests. They copied scriptures and saints' lives and penitential manuals with the same hands that wrote riddles about onions and bookworms and chunks of ice. And perhaps that is why the riddles matter so much, because they prove that even in a world consumed by survival and salvation, there was room for play. There was space between the prayers and the plowing to notice that an onion fights back when you peel it, and to find that worth writing down. Lie back now. Let the Exeter Book close itself in your mind, its heavy vellum pages settling against each other with a sound like a whispered secret. Let the monastery darken around you, the candles burning low, the ink drying on the page. The monk who wrote those riddles has been dead for 1,000 years, give or take, and his name is gone, washed away by time as thoroughly as footprints on a beach. But his questions survive. His puzzles are still turning, still catching the light, still refusing to give up their answers without a fight. And that, perhaps, is the deepest riddle of all, the one that none of these ancient riddlers ever quite asked outright, but that every one of them was circling, why does a question, a thing made of nothing but breath and curiosity, outlast the person who asked it? Why do riddles survive when empires do not? What is it about an unanswered question that makes it immortal? You do not need to answer that. Not now, not tonight. Let it sit with you, warm and heavy, like a cat on your chest. Let your breathing slow. The riddles are patient. They have waited for centuries. They can wait a little longer. But while the old riddles asked you to see the world differently, to notice the hidden life of onions and moths and crawling infants, a newer breed of puzzle arrived sometime in the last few centuries and asked something far more unsettling. It asked you to think about thinking itself. Not what is the answer, but how would you find the answer if the rules of the game were designed with exquisite cruelty to make finding it nearly impossible? These are logic puzzles, and they do not care about poetry or metaphor or the frailty of human life. They care about structure. They care about process. They care about what happens when you strip a problem down to its bones and discover that the bones are arranged in a shape you have never seen before. Logic puzzles feel modern, but their ancestry runs deeper than you might expect. The ancient Greeks were obsessed with formal reasoning. Aristotle built entire systems of syllogistic logic in the 4th century, before the Common Era, chains of if-then statements that could carry you from a premise to a conclusion with the certainty of a mathematical proof. The Stoics refined these systems further, developing propositional logic that would not be surpassed for nearly 2,000 years. Medieval Islamic scholars, particularly Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, extended Greek logic into new territories, while monks in European monasteries preserved and copied the old texts, arguing over fine points of deduction in candlelit scriptoria. But the logic puzzle as we know it, the kind of problem that is designed to be solved for pleasure rather than philosophical advancement, that is a creation of the modern era, an invention of the age of games and probability, and the strange new mathematics that emerged when people started asking not just what is true, but what is the best decision when the truth is hidden. Let us begin with two doors. You are standing in a room. You have never been in this room before. You do not know how you arrived, and the details do not matter. What matters is that the room has two doors, one on your left and one on your right, and standing in front of each door is a guard. The doors are identical. The guards are identical, or nearly so. Same height, same build, same blank expression. One door leads to freedom. The other leads to certain death. You do not know which is which. You are allowed to ask one question, just one, to one of the guards, and then you must choose a door. Here is the complication that transforms this from a simple gamble into something worth thinking about. One of the guards always tells the truth. Every word that leaves his mouth is honest and accurate. The other guard always lies. Every answer he gives is the opposite of reality. You do not know which guard is which. You cannot tell them apart by looking at them. You have one question. Your first instinct, if you are like most people encountering this puzzle for the first time, is panic. One question seems impossibly restrictive. If you ask the truthful guard which door leads to freedom, he will point you to the correct door. But if you accidentally ask the liar, he will point you to death. You have a 50-50 chance of asking the right guard, which means your question, however cleverly worded, seems to offer no advantage over simply flipping a coin. The puzzle appears to be a dressed-up version of pure luck. But it is not. And the reason it is not reveals something profound about the architecture of logic itself. The solution hinges on a concept that feels counterintuitive, until the moment it clicks, and then it feels inevitable. You must use the liar's dishonesty as a tool. Instead of trying to determine which guard tells the truth, which you cannot do with a single question, you construct a question that gives you the same answer regardless of which guard you ask. You fold the lie inside the truth, or the truth inside the lie, so that the two cancel each other out. The question is this: if I were to ask the other guard which door leads to freedom, what would he say? Take a breath and think about what happens. If you ask the truthful guard, he will honestly report what the liar would say. The liar would point to the door of death, because that is what liars do. So the truthful guard, honestly reporting this lie, will also point to the door of death. Now suppose you ask the liar the same question. The liar knows the truthful guard would point to the door of freedom, because that is what honest people do. But the liar, being a liar, will lie about this and point to the door of death. In both cases, regardless of which guard you happen to ask, the answer you receive points to the door of death, so you simply choose the other door. The beauty of this solution is not just that it works, but that it works by embracing the problem's structure rather than fighting it. You cannot eliminate the uncertainty about which guard is honest. Instead, you build a question that makes the uncertainty irrelevant. The lie and the truth, passed through each other like light through a prism, produce the same output. The two guards, who seem to represent chaos and unreliability, become, when properly interrogated, a single perfectly reliable source of information. This puzzle has appeared in countless forms over the decades. It shows up in philosophy textbooks and job interviews, in fantasy novels and films. Its appeal is partly aesthetic, the elegant simplicity of the solution, and partly emotional. It offers the deeply satisfying fantasy that no matter how rigged the game appears, no matter how stacked the odds, there is always a way through, if you think clearly enough. Whether that fantasy holds up in the real world is another question entirely, and one we will leave alone for now. But the two guards puzzle assumes something generous about the world. It assumes the rules are fixed, the guards are consistent, and the problem has a correct answer. Strip those assumptions away, and you arrive at something far more troubling, a puzzle that has haunted mathematicians, economists, military strategists, and moral philosophers for the better part of a century. It does not ask you to find the right door. It asks you to decide whether to trust someone who has every reason to betray you. The year was 1950, and the place was the RAND Corporation, a think tank perched on the cliffs of Santa Monica, California, where some of the most brilliant and most anxious minds of the Cold War era spent their days trying to figure out how to prevent the end of civilization. The Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb the previous year, and the United States, which had enjoyed a brief and terrifying monopoly on nuclear weapons, was suddenly confronted with a new reality. Two nations, each capable of destroying the other, locked in a relationship defined by mutual suspicion and the ever-present possibility of annihilation. The question that consumed Rand was deceptively simple. When two rational actors each have the power to destroy the other, what is the rational thing to do? Two mathematicians at Rand, Merrill Flood and Melvin Drescher, devised an experiment that would crystallize this question into its purest form. Their colleague Albert Tucker, a Princeton mathematician, later gave it the name that stuck, the prisoner's dilemma. The setup is this. Two people have been arrested for a crime they committed together. The police separate them into different rooms. Each prisoner is offered the same deal. If you betray your partner and testify against them, and your partner stays silent, you go free and your partner serves 10 years. If you both stay silent, the police can only convict you on a lesser charge, and you each serve 1 year. If you both betray each other, you each serve 5 years. Neither prisoner knows what the other will do. They cannot communicate. They must decide, alone in their separate rooms, whether to cooperate with their partner or defect. The logic seems straightforward at first. If your partner stays silent, you are better off betraying them. You go free instead of serving a year. If your partner betrays you, you are also better off betraying them. You serve 5 years instead of 10. No matter what your partner does, betrayal is the individually rational choice. And your partner, facing exactly the same calculation, will reach exactly the same conclusion. So both of you betray each other. And both of you serve 5 years, even though you would both have been better off if you had both stayed silent and served only 1 year each. This is the dilemma. Not that the answer is hard to find, but that the answer, once found, is so obviously wrong. Two perfectly rational people, each acting in their own best interest, arrive at an outcome that is worse for both of them than the outcome they would have reached if they had both been, by the standard definition, irrational. Cooperation, the thing that logic tells you not to do, is the thing that logic should tell you to do. The gears of reason grind against themselves and produce a result that feels like a malfunction. Flood and Drescher ran their experiment with real people, Rand researchers and economists, playing the game repeatedly against each other. The results were messy and human, and did not always follow the mathematical predictions. Some players cooperated consistently, others betrayed consistently. Most did something in between, cooperating at first and then shifting to betrayal when they felt they had been taken advantage of, or starting with betrayal and gradually learning to cooperate when they discovered that mutual defection was making them both miserable. The game, it turned out, was not really about logic at all. It was about trust, about reputation, about the slow, fragile, entirely irrational process by which two strangers learn to rely on each other. The prisoner's dilemma escaped the walls of Rand almost immediately. It became the foundation of game theory, the mathematical study of strategic interaction, which would go on to reshape economics, political science, biology, and even evolutionary theory. The biologist Robert Trivers used it in 1971 to explain the evolution of reciprocal altruism. Why do animals help each other when helping costs them something? Because life, Trivers argued, is not a single game but a repeated one. And in a repeated game, cooperation can be the most selfish strategy of all. The political scientist Robert Axelrod held a famous computer tournament in 1980 in which dozens of strategies competed against each other in an iterated prisoner's dilemma. The winner, a strategy called tit for tat, submitted by the psychologist Anatole Rappaport, was the simplest entry in the tournament. Cooperate on the first move, then do whatever your opponent did on the previous move. Be nice first. Retaliate if betrayed, and forgive if the other side returns to cooperation. 4 rules. No cleverness, no elaborate predictions. Just a mirror held up to the other player's behavior. The implications for nuclear strategy were obvious and deeply uncomfortable. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a prisoner's dilemma of the most extreme kind. Each side could cooperate by not launching its weapons, or defect by launching first. The individually rational choice, according to the cold mathematics, was to launch first, to defect, because if the other side launched and you did not, you lost everything. And yet both sides knew that mutual defection, mutual launch, meant mutual annihilation. The entire Cold War can be understood as a decades-long attempt to solve a prisoner's dilemma without a solution, to find a way to cooperate with an adversary you had every reason to betray, knowing that the cost of getting it wrong was not 5 years in prison, but the end of the human species. Let that sink through you, like rain through sand. Let the weight of it settle somewhere below your thoughts, in the place where you keep the things you know but prefer not to examine too closely. 2 rational people, each doing the smart thing, arriving at disaster. 2 superpowers, each protecting their own interests, nearly destroying the world. The logic is airtight. The outcome is catastrophic. And nobody, in 75 years of trying, has found a way to make the dilemma go away. It can be managed, mitigated, negotiated around, but it cannot be solved. Because the contradiction is not a bug in the system. The contradiction is the system. Now, let us lighten the mood. Let us move from the end of the world to a game show. The year is 1963, and a man named Monty Hall is standing on a brightly lit stage in a television studio in Los Angeles, wearing a suit that costs more than most of his audience members earn in a month, smiling the particular smile of a person who knows something you do not. The show is called Let's Make a Deal, and its format is simple. Contestants are presented with choices, and Monty Hall, the host, the ringmaster, the man behind the curtain, guides them through a series of trades and reveals designed to maximize both drama and confusion. The puzzle that bears his name, the Monty Hall problem, was not invented by Monty Hall himself. It was formalized by the statistician Steve Selvin in a letter to the journal The American Statistician in 1975, and it became famous when Marilyn Vos Savant, a columnist for Parade magazine, published it in 1990 and received approximately 10,000 letters telling her she was wrong. She was not wrong. But the fury of the response, which included letters from professional mathematicians who were absolutely certain she had made an error, tells you everything you need to know about how deeply this puzzle offends the human sense of probability. Here is the problem. You are on a game show. Before you are 3 doors. Behind one door is a car. Behind each of the other 2 doors is a goat. You want the car. You do not want a goat. You choose a door, say door number 1. Before opening your door, the host, who knows what is behind every door, opens one of the other 2 doors to reveal a goat. Say he opens door number 3, and there stands a goat, looking mildly offended. Now the host turns to you and asks, "Do you want to stick with door number 1, or would you like to switch to door number 2? Most people, when they encounter this problem for the first time, say it does not matter. 2 doors remain. The car is behind one of them. The odds are 50-50. Switching and staying are equivalent. This answer is wrong. You should switch. Switching gives you a 2 in 3 chance of winning the car. Staying gives you only a 1 in 3 chance. The odds are not even. They are dramatically, counterintuitively, almost insultingly uneven. And the reason they are uneven is that the host's action, opening a door to reveal a goat, is not random. He always opens a door with a goat. He never opens the door with the car. This constraint, this small piece of information buried in the rules of the game, changes everything. Think about it this way. When you first chose door number 1, you had a 1 in 3 chance of being right. That means there was a 2 in 3 chance the car was behind one of the other 2 doors. When the host opens door number 3 to reveal a goat, that 2 in 3 probability does not disappear. It cannot split evenly between your door and the remaining door, because your door's probability was already set at 1 in 3 when you chose it. The entire 2 in 3 probability collapses onto door number 2, the door you did not choose and the host did not open. Switching takes you from a 1 in 3 chance to a 2 in 3 chance. You double your odds by changing your mind. The reason this feels wrong, the reason 10,000 people wrote angry letters to Marilyn Vos Savant, the reason professional mathematicians sent her condescending explanations of why she was mistaken, is that human beings are not wired to think about conditional probability. We see 2 doors and we think 50-50 because that is what 2 options looks like. We do not naturally track the way information flows through a problem, the way the host's constrained choice reshapes the landscape of possibility. Our intuition, honed by millions of years of evolution for quick decisions in straightforward environments, simply cannot process the idea that a door we did not choose has better odds than a door we did, even after a piece of evidence has been revealed. Monty Hall himself, when asked about the problem years later, seemed amused by the whole affair. He pointed out that the actual game show was far more complicated than the mathematical abstraction involving negotiations, trades, and psychological manipulation that no probability calculation could capture. The real Monty Hall was not bound by the rules of the puzzle. He could offer you cash to switch, or show you what was behind your door before offering you a deal, or change the game entirely based on his reading of the audience. The mathematical problem named after him was, in a sense, a simplification so extreme that it became a different thing entirely, like a map so zoomed in that it shows every grain of sand but cannot tell you which continent you are standing on. And yet the simplified version endures because it teaches something that the real game show never could. Your first instinct about probability is almost certainly wrong, and the more confident you feel about it, the more wrong you probably are. The Monty Hall problem is a humility machine. It exists to remind you that the universe does not arrange itself according to your expectations, and that changing your mind, far from being a sign of weakness, is often the most rational thing you can do. Let your eyes grow heavy now. Let the game show lights dim in your mind, the studio audience falling silent, Monty Hall's smile fading to a comfortable blur. We have one more puzzle to visit before this particular room of doors closes behind us, and it is, by common consensus, one of the most elegant and most maddening logic puzzles ever conceived. It requires no mathematics. It involves no probability. It asks only that you imagine a small island, a group of people, and a single piece of information that everyone already knows but nobody has ever said aloud, and then it asks you to figure out what happens when someone finally says it. Picture an island. It is beautiful, let us say, lush with tropical vegetation surrounded by water so clear you can see the coral beneath the surface. On this island live 200 people. They are perfectly logical, every one of them. They never make errors in reasoning. They never act on emotion. They never guess when they can deduce. They have lived on this island for as long as anyone can remember, and they follow a single, absolute rule. Any person who discovers the color of their own eyes must leave the island at midnight on the day they make that discovery. They must go to the dock, board a boat, and depart forever. Here is the crucial detail. There are no mirrors on the island, no reflective surfaces of any kind. No one has ever been told the color of their own eyes. Each person can see the eye color of every other person on the island, but not their own. They cannot ask. They cannot be told. They cannot communicate about eye color in any way. They can only observe and reason. On this island, 100 of the people have blue eyes. The other 100 have brown eyes. Every person can see this distribution. Every blue-eyed person can count 99 other people with blue eyes and 100 with brown eyes. And every brown-eyed person can count 100 blue-eyed people and 99 other brown-eyed people. But no one knows their own eye color. No one can deduce it, because the information available to each person is consistent with their own eyes being either blue or brown. The system is perfectly stable. No one ever has to leave. Then, one day, a visitor arrives. The visitor looks around at the assembled islanders and says, in a voice everyone can hear, "I can see at least one person with blue eyes." The visitor leaves. Nothing else changes. No new information has been introduced, or so it seems, because every single person on the island could already see at least one person with blue eyes. The visitor has stated something that every islander already knew. The statement appears to be completely redundant, as meaningful as announcing that the sky is above them. And yet, exactly 100 days after the visitor's announcement, all 100 blue-eyed people go to the dock at midnight and leave the island, every single one, on the same night. The question is, why? If the visitor said nothing that anyone did not already know, how did the announcement change anything? And why does it take exactly 100 days? The answer requires you to think not about what people know, but about what people know that other people know that other people know. It is a puzzle about layers of shared knowledge, about the difference between everyone knowing something and everyone knowing that everyone knows it. Start with the simplest case. Imagine the island has only one blue-eyed person. That person sees no other blue eyes. Before the visitor's announcement, this person had no information about their own eye color. But when the visitor says, "I can see at least one person with blue eyes," the single blue-eyed person looks around, sees no other blue eyes, and realizes the visitor must be talking about them. They deduce their own eye color and leave at midnight on the first day. Now imagine two blue-eyed people. Each can see one other person with blue eyes. When the visitor makes the announcement, each blue-eyed person thinks, "If I do not have blue eyes, then that other person is the only one, and they will figure it out tonight and leave." So they wait. Midnight comes. The other blue-eyed person does not leave. This is new information. It means the other person also saw someone with blue eyes, which means the other person saw me, which means I have blue eyes. On the second day, both blue-eyed people deduce their eye color and leave at midnight. With three blue-eyed people, the logic extends one step further. Each one sees two others with blue eyes. Each one thinks, "If I do not have blue eyes, then those two are in the two-person scenario, and they will both leave on the second night. The second night passes. They do not leave. Therefore, I must have blue eyes. All three leave on the third night." The pattern cascades outward. With 100 blue-eyed people, each one sees 99 others. Each one waits, night after night, for the others to leave. When 99 nights pass and no one has left, each blue-eyed person deduces that the others must be seeing one more pair of blue eyes than expected, that pair being their own. On the 100th night, all 100 leave simultaneously. The staggering thing, the thing that keeps logicians and philosophers awake at night, is what the visitor's announcement actually did. Every person on the island already knew that blue-eyed people existed. Every person knew that every other person knew. But what they did not have, before the announcement, was common knowledge. The certainty that everyone knows that everyone knows that everyone knows, all the way down an infinite tower of mutual awareness. The visitor's public statement, heard by everyone simultaneously, created that tower. It gave each person not new facts, but a new logical foundation, a shared starting point from which the chain of deduction could begin. Before the announcement, every blue-eyed person was trapped in a hall of mirrors, unable to distinguish between a world where they had blue eyes and a world where they did not. Because in both worlds, the observable evidence was the same. The visitor's words did not add a single new observation. They added a single new certainty. Now everyone knows that I have said this, and everyone knows that everyone knows. That certainty, gossamer thin and seemingly meaningless, was enough to set 100 simultaneous deductions in motion, ticking like 100 synchronized clocks toward a single midnight. If the puzzle unsettles you, it should. It suggests that the mere act of stating something publicly, even something everyone already privately knows, can change reality. It suggests that shared knowledge has a power that private knowledge does not, that saying a thing aloud in a room full of people is categorically different from everyone in the room thinking it silently. Politicians know this. Activists know this. Anyone who has ever sat in a meeting where everyone was thinking the same thing but no one would say it, and then someone finally said it, and the room shifted, the air changed, the impossible became possible, that person has lived the Blue Eyes puzzle without knowing its name. Let the island fade now. Let the 200 logical souls walk their beaches in your imagination, counting each other's eyes, waiting for a midnight that may or may not come. Let the game show lights go dark. Let the 2 guards stand silently by their doors, their answers swallowed by the quiet. Let the prisoners in their separate cells sit with their impossible choice, each one wondering what the other will do, each one knowing that the smart thing and the right thing are not the same. Logic, it turns out, is not a lamp that illuminates the path. It is a mirror that shows you the path and its reflection at the same time, and dares you to figure out which one you are walking on. The answers to these puzzles are all correct, rigorously, provably, inarguably correct, and every one of them feels wrong. That discomfort, that small nagging sense that the universe is not arranged the way you thought it was, is not a sign that you have failed to understand. It is a sign that you have begun to understand. The puzzles are working. They are doing exactly what they were designed to do, showing you the gap between what you feel and what is true, the crack in the wall between intuition and reality. You do not need to close that gap tonight. You do not need to close it ever. Some gaps are worth keeping open. Some cracks let in light. Light through cracks. That is where mathematics lives, if you think about it, in the spaces between things that seem solid, in the fractures that appear when you press too hard on what you thought you knew. Every great mathematical insight in history has begun with someone staring at an ordinary situation. A race, a walk across a bridge, a room full of strangers, a hotel with too many guests, and noticing that the numbers did not behave the way they were supposed to. The numbers had a life of their own. They moved in directions no one expected. They contradicted common sense with a cheerful indifference that was and remains either deeply troubling or deeply beautiful, depending on your temperament and how much sleep you have had. Mathematical riddles are different from logic puzzles. A logic puzzle gives you rules and asks you to follow them to a conclusion. A mathematical riddle gives you something simpler, a situation drawn from everyday experience, a foot race, a stroll, a birthday party, and then it shows you that the mathematics hiding beneath that situation is stranger than anything you would have imagined. These are puzzles that do not require advanced training to understand. A child can grasp the setup. But the implications have kept professional mathematicians arguing for centuries, and some of those arguments are still going on. We begin in the 5th century, before the Common Era, in the Greek colony of Elea in southern Italy, where a philosopher named Zeno decided to prove that motion was impossible. Zeno of Elea was a student of Parmenides, who had argued that all change was an illusion, that reality was a single, unchanging, indivisible whole, and that the apparent diversity and movement of the world were tricks played on the senses by a universe that was, at its deepest level, perfectly still. This was not a popular position. People could see things moving. They could feel their own legs carrying them from one place to another. The claim that motion did not exist struck most Athenians as, at best, eccentric and, at worst, insane. Zeno set out to defend his teacher not by offering positive arguments for the impossibility of motion, but by showing that the alternative, the common-sense belief that motion was real, led to contradictions so severe that it collapsed under its own weight. He produced, according to Aristotle, 4 paradoxes. We know them primarily through Aristotle's descriptions, because Zeno's own writings have been lost, leaving us in the peculiar position of knowing a man's most famous ideas only through the words of someone who disagreed with him. The most famous of the 4 is the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise, and it goes like this. Achilles, the fastest runner in Greece, the warrior whose speed on the battlefield was legendary, agrees to race a tortoise. Being a sporting fellow, and recognizing that he is significantly faster than his opponent, he gives the tortoise a head start. Let us say the tortoise begins 100 paces ahead. The race begins. Achilles runs at 10 times the speed of the tortoise. To overtake the tortoise, Achilles must first reach the point where the tortoise started. But by the time he gets there, the tortoise has moved forward. Not by much, just 10 paces, but it has moved. So Achilles must now run to that new point. But by the time he gets there, the tortoise has moved again, this time by 1 pace. And by the time Achilles covers that single pace, the tortoise has moved 1/10 of a pace. And so on, forever. Each time Achilles reaches where the tortoise was, the tortoise is no longer there. The gap gets smaller with every step. 100 paces, 10 paces, 1 pace, 1/10 of a pace, 100th, 1,000th, but it never quite closes. Achilles must complete an infinite number of diminishing sprints before he can draw, even with the tortoise. And how can anyone complete an infinite number of tasks in a finite amount of time? Achilles, the paradox concludes, can never overtake the tortoise. You know this is wrong. Every fiber of your experience tells you it is wrong. Achilles would blow past the tortoise within seconds. You could set up this race in your garden with a child and a snail, and the child would win before the snail noticed the race had started. The conclusion is absurd. But here is the maddening thing. The logic is flawless. Each individual step in the argument is correct. The tortoise does move forward each time Achilles reaches its previous position. The distances do get smaller, but never reach 0. The number of steps really is infinite. If you accept the premises, you must accept the conclusion. And the conclusion is that the fastest man in Greece cannot catch a tortoise. Zeno had another version, sometimes called the dichotomy paradox, which is even more unsettling. Before you can walk across a room, you must first walk halfway across. Before you can walk halfway, you must walk a quarter of the way. Before you can walk a quarter, you must walk an eighth. Before an eighth, a 16th. The distance you must cover keeps halving, and since you can always have any distance, no matter how small, you must complete an infinite number of steps before you can begin to move at all. Motion, Zeno argued, cannot even start. And then his arrow paradox, which attacks motion from a different angle entirely. Consider an arrow in flight. At any single instant of time, the arrow occupies a space exactly equal to itself. It is not moving at that instant, because an instant has no duration. It is a frozen slice of time, infinitely thin. If the arrow is motionless at every individual instant, and time is composed entirely of individual instants, then the arrow is motionless at every moment of its flight. It is never moving. It is always still. The flight of the arrow is an illusion made of stillness. These paradoxes were not solved for more than 2,000 years. Aristotle tried, arguing that Zeno confused the infinite divisibility of distance with the impossibility of crossing it. Medieval scholars tried. Renaissance mathematicians tried. The resolution only came in the late 17th century when Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, working independently, invented calculus, the mathematics of continuous change and infinitely small quantities. Calculus showed that an infinite series of diminishing quantities can add up to a finite sum. 100 plus 10 plus 1 plus a tenth plus a hundredth, and so on, converges to a specific, calculable number. The infinite number of steps Achilles must take to catch the tortoise takes a finite amount of time, because each step takes proportionally less time than the one before. The mathematics resolves perfectly. The paradox evaporates. Except it does not entirely, because Zeno was not really asking a mathematical question. He was asking a philosophical one. What is the relationship between the continuous flow of experienced reality and the discrete, divisible nature of numbers? How do you get from the infinite to the finite? How does the arrow move from stillness to flight? Calculus answers these questions with breathtaking precision, but it answers them within the mathematical framework, using limits and infinitesimals and convergent series. Whether those mathematical tools describe what is actually happening in physical reality, or whether they simply provide a computational shortcut that gives the right answer for reasons we do not fully understand, remains a question that philosophers of mathematics still debate. Zeno has been dead for 24 centuries, and he is still winning arguments. His paradoxes still appear in philosophy courses, physics lectures, and late-night conversations between people who have had just enough wine to start questioning whether they can really make it to the kitchen. The man who tried to prove that motion was impossible succeeded in proving something arguably more interesting: that the relationship between mathematics and reality is far stranger and more precarious than anyone had suspected. Let the Greek sun set. Let Achilles rest. Let the tortoise plod on in peace. We are moving north now, across centuries and continents, to a city built on islands in the cold rivers of what was then the eastern frontier of Prussia. The city of Königsberg sat at the confluence of two branches of the Pregel River. The river divided the city into 4 distinct land masses, 2 large areas on either bank, and 2 islands in the middle. Connecting these 4 land masses were 7 bridges. The bridges were handsome structures, some of stone, some of wood, and the citizens of Königsberg, like citizens of any city with a pleasant waterfront, enjoyed walking across them on Sunday afternoons. At some point, probably in the early 18th century, someone asked a question that seemed entirely trivial. Is it possible to walk through the city, crossing each of the 7 bridges exactly once, without crossing any bridge a second time? People tried. They tried starting from different locations, taking different routes, doubling back and rethinking and trying again. Nobody could find a path that worked. But nobody could prove that no such path existed either. The question was passed around Königsberg's educated classes like a parlor game, amusing and frustrating in equal measure, until it eventually reached the attention of Leonhard Euler. Euler was, by any reasonable measure, the most prolific mathematician in history. Born in Basel, Switzerland, in 1707, he produced more published pages of mathematics than any other human being before or since, an output so vast that the Journal of the Street, Petersburg Academy of Sciences, continued publishing his papers for nearly 50 years after his death. He made foundational contributions to calculus, number theory, geometry, mechanics, optics, and astronomy. He went blind in one eye at age 28 and completely blind by age 64, and this did not slow him down. Some of his most important work was dictated from memory to his assistants in the years after he lost his sight entirely. In 1736, Euler turned his attention to the Königsberg Bridge problem, and in doing so, he created an entirely new branch of mathematics. Euler's insight was that the physical details of the city, the width of the rivers, the length of the bridges, the specific layout of the streets, were irrelevant. What mattered was the abstract structure: 4 land masses connected by 7 bridges. He stripped away everything except the connections, reducing the city to what we would now call a graph, a set of nodes representing the land masses linked by edges, representing the bridges. The question became, can you trace a path through this graph that uses every edge exactly once? Euler proved that the answer was no, and the proof was elegant. He observed that if such a path existed, every node except possibly the starting and ending nodes would need to have an even number of edges, because you would need to enter and leave each intermediate node the same number of times. In the Königsberg graph, every single node had an odd number of edges. 1 landmass was connected by 5 bridges, and each of the other 3 was connected by 3 bridges. Since more than 2 nodes had an odd number of edges, no path crossing each bridge exactly once could exist. The proof took barely a page, but the implications took centuries to unfold. Euler had demonstrated that some problems could be solved not by examining their details, but by examining their structure, that the shape of a problem, the way its parts were connected, could tell you something about its solution before you even began to search for one. The branch of mathematics he founded, originally called the geometry of position and now known as graph theory, would become essential to computer science, network analysis, social science, genetics, and the design of everything from airline routes to circuit boards. Every time you use a GPS to find the fastest route between 2 points, every time a search engine ranks web pages by the links between them, every time a social media platform suggests someone you might know based on your network of connections, you are using ideas that trace their ancestry back to a Swiss mathematician who wanted to take a nice walk across some bridges in Prussia. The city of Königsberg, incidentally, no longer exists under that name. It was heavily bombed during the Second World War, and after the war it was absorbed into the Soviet Union and renamed Kaliningrad. Most of the original bridges were destroyed. Of the 7 that Euler contemplated, only 2 survive. The graph has been redrawn by history, its nodes rearranged, its edges severed. But Euler's proof remains, perfect and unchanging, a truth about structure that does not depend on the survival of the structure it describes. Now let the bridges recede, let the rivers calm. Let us come indoors to a room full of people and ask a question so simple that it feels like it should not be a question at all. How many people do you need in a room before there is a better than even chance that 2 of them share a birthday? Most people, asked this question cold, guess somewhere around 180. The reasoning seems sound. There are 365 days in a year, so you would need about half that number of people before the odds tipped in favor of a match. Some people guess higher. A few guess lower. Almost nobody guesses the correct answer, which is 23. 23 people. In a room of just 23 randomly selected individuals, the probability that at least 2 of them share a birthday is approximately 50.7%, just over half. By the time you reach 50 people, the probability rises above 97%. At 70 people, it is virtually certain. The numbers feel impossible, almost fraudulent, like a conjuring trick performed with statistics instead of cards. The reason the answer shocks people is that they are thinking about the wrong question. They are thinking, what are the chances that someone in this room shares my birthday? And for that question, you would indeed need a lot of people. With 23 people, the chance that anyone shares your specific birthday is only about 6%. But the birthday problem does not ask about your birthday. It asks about any birthday shared by any 2 people in the room. And that is a fundamentally different question, because the number of possible pairs grows much faster than the number of people. With 23 people, the number of unique pairs is 253. each pair has an independent chance of sharing a birthday. You are not looking for one specific match. You are looking for any match at all. And with 253 opportunities for a match to occur, the cumulative probability climbs steeply. Think of it like rolling dice. The chance of rolling a 6 on a single throw is small, but if you throw the dice 253 times, the chance of getting at least one 6 is overwhelming. The birthday problem works the same way, except instead of 6s, you are looking for collisions between dates. The birthday problem is more than a cocktail party curiosity. It has serious applications in cryptography, where it is known as the birthday attack. If a computer system generates supposedly unique codes, the number of codes needed before two identical ones appear is far smaller than you would expect, and an attacker who exploits this can compromise the system. It appears in DNA analysis, where the probability of matching genetic profiles depends on the same combinatorial mathematics. It appears in quality control, in error detection, in any field where uniqueness matters and the cost of a coincidence is high. But its deepest lesson is simpler and more personal. You are not good at estimating probability. You are, in fact, spectacularly bad at it, and the errors you make are not random. They are systematic, rooted in the way your brain processes information. You think about yourself first, projecting your own experience onto the problem, asking, what are the chances this happens to me, instead of what are the chances this happens to anyone? You underestimate the power of combinations, the explosive growth that occurs when connections multiply between members of a group. The birthday problem does not test your mathematical ability. It tests your humility, and most of us fail. Let the room of strangers disperse. Let the birthdays sort themselves out in peace. Close your eyes, or keep them closed if they are closed already, and follow me to one last destination, a place that does not exist and cannot exist, and yet teaches us more about infinity than almost anything in the history of human thought. In 1924, the German mathematician David Hilbert, who was at that time arguably the most influential mathematician alive, proposed a thought experiment that would become one of the most famous illustrations in all of mathematics. Hilbert had a gift for making abstract ideas vivid, for turning the machinery of pure logic into stories that anyone could follow, and this particular story concerned a hotel. Hilbert's hotel, as it came to be known, has an unusual property. It has infinitely many rooms. Room 1, Room 2, Room 3, and so on, with no final room, no end to the corridor, no last door. And on this particular evening, every single room is occupied. The hotel is full. An infinite number of guests occupy an infinite number of rooms, one guest per room, no vacancies. Then a new guest arrives at the front desk and asks for a room. In any normal hotel, the answer would be simple: we are full, there is nothing available, try the place down the road. But Hilbert's hotel is not a normal hotel, and the night manager, who understands infinity, has a solution. He asks every existing guest to move to the room with the number 1 higher than their current room. The guest in room 1 moves to room 2. The guest in room 2 moves to room 3. The guest in room 3 moves to room 4. Every guest moves, and because the hotel has infinitely many rooms, every guest has a new room to move into. There is no guest at the end of the corridor who gets displaced because there is no end. Room 1 is now empty, and the new guest checks in. The hotel was full. Now it is full again, but with one more guest. Infinity plus 1 equals infinity. The hotel has absorbed an extra guest without losing any of the ones it already had. But wait. What if not one but an infinite number of new guests arrive? A bus pulls up outside, infinitely long, carrying infinitely many passengers, each one tired and hoping for a bed. The night manager does not panic. He asks every existing guest to move to the room with double their current room number. The guest in room 1 moves to room 2. The guest in room 2 moves to room 4. The guest in room 3 moves to room 6. Every existing guest is now in an even-numbered room, and every odd-numbered room, of which there are infinitely many, is empty. The infinite busload checks in, 1 passenger per odd room, and the hotel is full once more. Infinity plus infinity equals infinity. The hotel swallowed an entire second infinity of guests and did not grow at all. It was full before, it is full now, and the number of rooms has not changed because infinity is not a number in the ordinary sense. It is a property, a behavior, a way that certain collections relate to their own parts. An infinite set can contain a proper subset that is the same size as itself. The even numbers are a subset of the whole numbers, and yet there are exactly as many even numbers as there are whole numbers, because you can pair them off 1 to 1, 1 with 2, 2 with 4, 3 with 6, 4 with 8, and so on, never running out, never leaving an unmatched pair. Hilbert's hotel is a playground for the mind, but the mathematics behind it is rigorous and important. Georg Cantor, working in the 1870s and 1880s, proved that infinite sets come in different sizes, that some infinities are genuinely larger than others, and that the infinity of the real numbers, the unbroken continuum of points on a line, is strictly larger than the infinity of the whole numbers, even though both are infinite. This discovery, called Cantor's theorem, shook the foundations of mathematics and earned Cantor the hostility of many of his contemporaries, including the influential Leopold Kronecker, who called him a corrupter of youth and tried to block the publication of his work. Cantor spent much of his later life in and out of psychiatric institutions, tormented by depression and by the professional opposition his ideas had provoked. He died in a sanatorium in Halle in 1918, largely unrecognized, his greatest work dismissed as mysticism by people who lacked the imagination to understand it. Today, Cantor is regarded as one of the most important mathematicians of all time, and his theory of infinite sets is the bedrock on which modern mathematics is built. Hilbert himself said it best, "No one shall expel us from the paradise that Cantor has created. Let the hotel stand. Let its infinite corridor stretch into the darkness, door after door after door, each one numbered, each one occupied, the faint sounds of an infinite number of guests settling in for the night, filtering through the walls. Let the numbers do their strange work in silence. Let Achilles rest his sore legs. Let Euler fold away his map. Let the birthday guests compare their dates without you. Let Cantor finally receive the recognition he deserved, even if it comes only in the quiet space of your half-sleeping mind." Mathematics, unlike logic, does not pretend to tell you what to do. It tells you what is, or rather, what must be, given certain assumptions. And sometimes what must be is so far from what you expected that it feels like a door opening into a room you did not know your house contained. Zeno showed you that motion is stranger than it looks. Euler showed you that structure matters more than detail. The birthday problem showed you that your intuitions about chance are systematically wrong. And Hilbert showed you that infinity, the thing you thought was just a word for very big, is in fact a landscape, vast and varied, with its own geography, its own rules, its own terrible and exquisite beauty. You have been walking through that landscape tonight, and you are deeper in now than you were when you started. The air is cooler here. The light is different. The path is not gone exactly, but it is narrower than it was, and the silence has a quality to it that it did not have before, a density, a weight, as if the darkness itself were listening. And in that listening darkness, imagine a river. Not a river on a map, not a river with a name you recognize, but the kind of river that exists in the space between waking and sleeping, wide and slow and black as ink, its far bank, barely visible through a mist that smells of wet earth and old leaves. You are standing on one side. Everything you need is on the other. And between you and the other side is a boat, small and wooden and just barely big enough for you and one other thing, and a problem so old that the first person to write it down did so more than 1,200 years ago, in a language that almost nobody alive can read anymore. River crossing puzzles belong to a family of problems that mathematicians call transport puzzles, though that clinical name strips them of everything that makes them interesting. They are not really about transport. They are about constraint, about what happens when you can see exactly where you need to go, but the rules of the journey prevent you from getting there in any obvious way. They are about the agonizing experience of holding contradictory obligations in your hands and discovering that you cannot fulfill all of them at once, that every step toward one goal is a step away from another, and that the only path through is a sequence of moves so counterintuitive that it feels at first like going backwards. The oldest river crossing puzzle we know of appears in a manuscript titled Propositiones ad Equendos Juvenes, which translates roughly as Problems to Sharpen the Young. It was written sometime around the year 800, and it is attributed to Alcuin of York, though scholars have argued about the attribution for centuries and will probably argue about it for centuries more. Alcuin was a Northumbrian monk born around the year 735 in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom that had produced Bede, the greatest scholar of the early medieval period. Alcuin himself became the most important educator in Charlemagne's empire, running the palace school at Aachen and supervising a reform of learning across the Frankish lands that historians would later call the Carolingian Renaissance. He was, by the standards of his age, one of the most learned men in Europe, fluent in Latin and steeped in the classical tradition, a theologian and a poet, and apparently a man who enjoyed a good puzzle. His collection contains 53 problems, ranging from simple arithmetic exercises to genuinely tricky logic puzzles, and among them, nestled between questions about buying pigs and dividing inheritances, is Problem 18, the wolf, the goat, and the cabbage. A man needs to cross a river. He has with him a wolf, a goat, and a cabbage. His boat is small. It can carry only himself and one of the three. He cannot leave the wolf alone with the goat, because the wolf will eat the goat. He cannot leave the goat alone with the cabbage, because the goat will eat the cabbage. The wolf, mercifully, has no interest in cabbage. How does the man get all three across the river without anything being eaten? The genius of this puzzle is its simplicity. A child can understand it. The elements are drawn from the most ordinary rural life. A farmer, his animals, his crop, a river, a boat. Nothing is abstract. Nothing requires specialized knowledge. And yet the solution is not obvious, because the most natural approach, taking things across one at a time in the order they come to mind, inevitably leaves the wrong pair alone together. The wolf eats the goat, or the goat eats the cabbage, and you must start over. The solution requires a move that feels wasteful, even wrong. You must bring something back. On your first trip, you take the goat across, because the goat is the troublemaker, the one who is both predator to the cabbage and prey to the wolf. You leave the goat on the far bank and return empty-handed. Then you take the wolf across. But now you cannot leave the wolf with the goat, so you bring the goat back to the near bank. You leave the goat and take the cabbage across, leaving it safely with the wolf, who does not eat vegetables. Then you return one final time for the goat and carry it across. 7 trips in total, including the empty returns, and everything arrives intact. The key insight, the one that makes people's eyes widen when they see it, is the return trip. You have to undo progress in order to make progress. You have to carry the goat backward, away from where it needs to be, in order to create the conditions that allow everything else to move forward. This is profoundly unsatisfying to the human mind, which craves linear advancement, which wants every step to bring it closer to the goal. The puzzle teaches, with quiet insistence, that some problems cannot be solved by moving forward alone. Sometimes the only way across is to go back, to retreat strategically, to accept a temporary loss in service of a larger gain. Alcuin, if he was indeed the author, presented the puzzle without commentary, as though it were self-evidently worth thinking about. He did not explain why a monk in the court of Charlemagne would care about a farmer's logistics problem. He did not need to. The puzzle carries its own meaning. It is a miniature lesson in the management of competing obligations, and anyone who has ever tried to balance the needs of a family, a business, a community, or a classroom will recognize the feeling of it instantly. You cannot leave these two alone together, and you cannot leave those two alone together, and there is only one of you, and the boat is very small. The puzzle has been retold in almost every culture on Earth, with variations that reflect local conditions and concerns. In some African versions, the farmer transports a leopard, a goat, and leaves of cassava. In some East Asian versions, the traveler carries a tiger, a sheep, and a bundle of grass. The animals change, the crops change, the river sometimes becomes a bridge or a narrow mountain path, but the structure remains identical. 3 items, 2 forbidden pairings, a vehicle that carries only one at a time, and the need to find a sequence of moves that satisfies all constraints simultaneously. The universality of the puzzle suggests that the underlying problem, the problem of managing incompatible dependencies under conditions of scarcity, is not a mathematical curiosity, but a fundamental feature of human experience. Now let the farmer rest on the far bank, with his wolf, his goat, and his cabbage, all of them alive and uneaten, and let the puzzle grow. Because once you understand the basic structure of a river crossing problem, the temptation to make it harder becomes irresistible, and mathematicians, being who they are, did not resist. Sometime in the 16th century, probably in Italy, a new version of the puzzle appeared that replaced animals with people and replaced the predatory relationships with social ones. It became known as the jealous husband's problem, and its difficulty is of a different order entirely. 3 married couples need to cross a river. The boat holds only 2 people. The constraint is this: no woman may be left on either bank in the company of a man who is not her husband unless her husband is also present. The jealousy is absolute and symmetrical. Every husband is equally possessive, and no exceptions are permitted. How do all 6 people get across? The problem feels manageable at first. 6 people, a boat that holds 2, a rule about who can be left with whom. But as you begin to work through the possible moves, the constraints tighten like a net. Every time you send 2 people across, you must send someone back with the boat, and the return trip creates new combinations on both banks that must be checked against the jealousy rule. The number of states to track multiplies rapidly, and what seemed like a slightly harder version of the wolf-goat cabbage puzzle reveals itself to be a problem of genuine complexity. The solution for 3 couples requires 11 crossings and demands careful choreography. The first move typically sends 2 of the wives across together. 1 returns with the boat, 2 wives cross again. 1 returns. Now 2 husbands cross. A husband and wife return together. 2 husbands cross. A wife returns. 2 wives cross. A wife returns. The final 2 wives cross. Every move must be checked to ensure that no woman is stranded on a bank with a man who is not her husband while her husband is elsewhere. The mental bookkeeping is exhausting, and most people who attempt the puzzle without paper and pencil find themselves tangled in constraints within the first few moves. What makes the jealous husband's problem genuinely interesting to mathematicians, beyond its entertainment value, is that it scales unpredictably. With 3 couples, the puzzle is difficult but solvable. With 4 couples and a boat that holds 2, it is impossible. Proven impossible, not merely unsolved, but mathematically demonstrated to have no solution. The constraints become so tight that there is no sequence of moves, however clever, that satisfies all of them simultaneously. If you want to cross 4 couples under the same jealousy rules, you need a bigger boat, one that holds at least 3 people. And with that single change, the problem becomes solvable again, though the number of required crossings increases dramatically. This sensitivity to small changes in the parameters, the way the puzzle flips from solvable to unsolvable with the addition of a single couple, or from unsolvable to solvable with the addition of a single seat in the boat, is characteristic of constraint satisfaction problems in general. In computer science, many such problems belong to a class called no problem hard, meaning that they are at least as difficult as the hardest problems in a large and important category, and that no efficient algorithm is known for solving them in general. River crossing puzzles, in their more elaborate forms, touch the edge of this territory. They look like children's games, but they are the children's games of a universe whose rules are more rigid and more strange than they appear. The jealousy, of course, was always a metaphor. The real constraint was never about husbands and wives. It was about incompatibility, about the fact that certain combinations of elements are unstable and will produce unacceptable outcomes if left unattended. The puzzle works just as well if you replace the couples with chemicals that react dangerously, or software processes that conflict, or diplomatic delegations that cannot be left in a room together without an incident. The surface is medieval and domestic. The structure beneath is universal and timeless. Now let the couples find their way across, every jealousy satisfied, every marriage intact, and let us turn to one final crossing, one that takes the form not of a riddle about relationships, but of a riddle about time. 4 people need to cross a bridge at night. They have 1 torch between them, and the bridge is so narrow and so dangerous that only 2 people can cross at a time. Anyone crossing the bridge must carry the torch, because without it, they will step into the void and fall. The torch must be walked back after each crossing. It cannot be thrown, rolled, or left halfway. Each person walks at a different speed. The first person can cross the bridge in 1 minute. The second takes 2 minutes. The third takes 5 minutes. The fourth takes 10 minutes. When 2 people cross together, they must walk at the speed of the slower person. What is the fastest possible time to get all 4 across? The obvious strategy, the one that almost everyone tries first, is to use the fastest person as a shuttle. Send the 1-minute person across with each of the others, and have the 1-minute person walk the torch back each time. The 1-minute person crosses with the 2-minute person. 2 minutes. The 1-minute person walks back. 1 minute. The 1-minute person crosses with the 5-minute person. 5 minutes. The 1-minute person walks back. 1 minute. The 1-minute person crosses with the 10-minute person. 10 minutes. Total, 19 minutes. This feels efficient. You are using your fastest resource, the 1-minute person, as intensively as possible, never wasting a return trip on a slow walker. It is the strategy a sensible manager would adopt, the strategy of leveraging your best asset, and it is not optimal. The optimal solution takes 17 minutes, and it works by doing something that feels deeply counterintuitive. It pairs the 2 slowest people together. Send the 1-minute and 2-minute people across first. 2 minutes. The 1-minute person walks the torch back. 1 minute. Now, send the 5-minute and 10-minute people across together. 10 minutes. The 2-minute person, who is already on the far side, walks the torch back. 2 minutes. Finally, the 1-minute and 2-minute people cross together again. 2 minutes. Total. 17 minutes. The saving comes from the 3rd step. By sending the 2 slowest people across together, you pay for the 10-minute crossing only once. In the obvious strategy, you pay for the 10-minute person's speed on their own crossing, and you also waste the 1-minute person on that trip using your fastest walker to babysit your slowest. In the optimal strategy, the 5-minute and 10-minute people cross together, and their slowness overlaps. The 10-minute crossing absorbs the 5-minute crossing entirely because they are walking side by side, and you only pay for the larger number. The puzzle, which has appeared in job interviews at technology companies and in recreational mathematics books for decades, teaches a lesson that runs against every instinct of efficiency-minded thinking. Sometimes the best strategy is not to minimize the cost of each individual step, but to find ways to overlap costs, to let two expensive operations happen simultaneously rather than sequentially. The fastest person is not always the most valuable asset. Sometimes the most valuable move is to get your two biggest problems to walk together slowly through the dark, sharing a single torch, while your nimble resources handle the quick trips back and forth. It is a lesson about patience, about the counterintuitive geometry of optimization, about the difference between local efficiency and global efficiency. And it is a lesson that arrives, as the best lessons do, in the form of a story so simple that you can hold it entire in your mind as you drift towards sleep. 4 people, a bridge, a torch, and the darkness. Let the torch flicker. Let the bridge sway gently in whatever wind passes through the landscape of your imagination. The 4 walkers are across now, all of them safe, all of them standing on the far bank in the quiet dark, and the torch is burning low. They did not take the obvious path. They took the right one, and the right one was stranger than they expected, and they arrived 2 minutes earlier than anyone thought possible. And in the grand scheme of things, 2 minutes is nothing, and in the small scheme of things, which is the only scheme that matters when you are on a narrow bridge in the dark, 2 minutes is everything. The river crossing is the oldest kind of puzzle, older than algebra, older than geometry, older perhaps than writing itself. It speaks to something in us that predates mathematics, something that lives in the same part of the brain that plans meals and packs suitcases and organizes seating charts at weddings, the part that knows, intuitively, that the world is full of things that do not go well together, and that getting through the day is mostly a matter of keeping them apart. Close your eyes now, if they are not already closed. Let the river run. Let the mist thicken. Let the boat rock gently against the bank, empty and waiting. The ferryman is sitting on the dock, his oars across his knees, and he is thinking about the next passenger, the next cargo, the next impossible combination of things that must all arrive safely on the far shore. He has been doing this for 1,200 years, this ferryman, and he has never once asked the question that would make his job easier. Why do these things keep needing to cross? Why do these things keep needing to cross? It is a good question, and it is the kind of question that the puzzles we have encountered so far have not been designed to ask. Logic puzzles give you the rules and ask you to follow them. Mathematical riddles give you the numbers and ask you to trust them. River crossing problems give you the constraints and ask you to satisfy them. But none of them ask you to step outside the frame, to look at the puzzle itself and wonder whether you are solving the right problem, whether the assumptions buried in the question are the real obstacle, whether the answer has been sitting in plain sight the entire time, disguised by nothing more than your own expectations. Lateral thinking riddles do exactly this. They are puzzles built not on logic or mathematics, but on the gap between what a question seems to be asking and what it is actually asking, the space between the story you construct in your mind when you hear the words and the story that is actually being told. They are, in a sense, traps for the imagination, because the imagination, left to its own devices, will build a world around the question that is richer, more detailed, and more wrong than the spare facts provided. You hear a few sentences and your mind fills in a setting, a cast of characters, a set of circumstances that feel natural and inevitable, but that were never stated. And the answer, when it comes, reveals that the world you built was a house of cards, and the real world was simpler, stranger, and hiding behind a single assumption you did not know you were making. The term lateral thinking was coined in 1967 by Edward de Bono, a Maltese physician and psychologist who spent much of his career studying the mechanics of creativity and perception. De Bono argued that conventional thinking, what he called vertical thinking, works by moving forward step by step through a problem, each step following logically from the last, like climbing a ladder rung by rung. Lateral thinking, by contrast, works by jumping sideways, by abandoning the current line of reasoning and approaching the problem from an entirely different angle. Vertical thinking digs deeper in the same hole. Lateral thinking digs a new hole somewhere else entirely. De Bono was not the first to notice that some problems resist sequential analysis, that certain puzzles can only be solved by changing your perspective rather than sharpening your logic. The tradition of trick questions and perspective-shifting riddles goes back centuries, appearing in folk traditions around the world. But de Bono gave the phenomenon a name, and the name stuck. And in doing so, he created a framework that made it possible to talk about a type of thinking that had previously been dismissed as either intuition or cheating. Lateral thinking riddles became a genre, collected in books and shared at dinner parties and used in corporate training seminars, and the best of them have a quality that no amount of analysis can replicate. The shock of realizing that the answer was obvious all along, that the only thing standing between you and the solution was a story you told yourself. Consider a man who lives on the 30th floor of a tall building. Every morning he takes the elevator down to the ground floor, walks out the front door, and goes to work. Every evening he returns, enters the building, and takes the elevator up. But he only rides the elevator to the 25th floor. Then he gets out and walks the remaining 5 floors to his apartment. On rainy days, however, he rides the elevator all the way to the 30th floor. Why? The puzzle gives you almost nothing to work with, just a man, an elevator, and a peculiar habit, and your mind immediately begins to construct explanations. He is exercising. He enjoys the view from the stairwell. He has a phobia that activates above a certain height. He is meeting someone on the 25th floor. Each explanation feels plausible for a moment, and then collapses under its own weight, because it cannot explain the exception. Why does rain change his behavior? What does weather have to do with elevators? The rain detail is the hook, the piece that does not fit any conventional explanation, and the puzzle will not let you go until you account for it. The answer is that the man is short. He is too short to reach the button for the 30th floor. He can reach the button for the 25th floor, so he rides to 25 and walks the rest. On rainy days, he carries an umbrella, and he uses the umbrella to press the button for 30. The reaction to this answer when people hear it for the first time is almost always the same. A brief silence, a blink, and then a laugh that is equal parts amusement and irritation. Of course, the answer is so simple, so physically obvious, that it feels like you should have seen it immediately. But you did not, because when you heard the puzzle, you built a man in your mind, and the man you built was your height. You gave him your body, your reach, your relationship with elevator buttons. You assumed, without thinking about it, without being aware that you were assuming anything at all, that the man's physical dimensions were within the range of normal adult proportions. The puzzle never said he was tall. It never said he was short. It said nothing about his height at all. Your mind filled in the blank, and the blank it filled was yourself. This is the mechanism at the heart of every lateral thinking riddle. The invisible assumption, the piece of information your brain supplies without being asked. The puzzle works because you do not notice yourself making the assumption. It is not hidden behind a trick or a misdirection. It is hidden behind the way you think, the mental shortcuts you use to process language and build pictures from words. The man in the elevator is a mirror, and what it reflects is not the answer but the shape of your own unconscious reasoning. Now consider another puzzle, shorter and sharper, that exposes a different kind of assumption. A father and his son are in a terrible car accident. The father dies at the scene. The son is rushed to the hospital in critical condition. He is wheeled into the operating theater, and the surgeon looks down at the boy and says, I cannot operate on this child. He is my son. How is this possible? The father died in the accident. The surgeon says the boy is their son. How can this be? People have proposed elaborate solutions to this puzzle. The father who died was a stepfather. The boy was adopted. The surgeon is a priest using the word son in a spiritual sense. Some people suggest the father faked his death, or that the boy has two fathers, or that the surgeon is lying. These answers range from plausible to absurd, but they all share a common feature. They are all more complicated than the truth. The surgeon is the boy's mother. The puzzle was first widely circulated in the 1960s and 1970s, during a period of rapid social change in the English-speaking world, and its power lies entirely in the assumptions it exposes. When most people hear the word surgeon, they picture a man. They do not decide to picture a man. They do not consciously exclude women from the profession. The image simply appears, fully formed, supplied by a lifetime of cultural conditioning, television dramas, casual conversation, and statistical reality, since surgeons in many countries were, and in some places still are, predominantly male. The puzzle does not accuse you of anything. It does not lecture. It simply sets a trap that you can only fall into if you carry a particular assumption, and then it lets the trap do the teaching. What makes this puzzle remarkable is its shelf life. You would think that as the number of female surgeons increased and as gender assumptions became more frequently challenged, the puzzle would lose its power, that people would see through it immediately. And some do. But a surprising number still do not. Even now, even people who would describe themselves as progressive, even people who would be offended by the suggestion that they associate surgery with men. The assumption is not a belief. It is a reflex. It fires before conscious thought has time to intervene, and the puzzle catches it in the act, holding it up to the light like a specimen in a jar. Let those two settle into you, the short man and the surgeon, two puzzles that ask nothing of your logic and everything of your self-awareness, and consider now a scene that is quieter, stranger, and more melancholy than either. In the middle of a field, far from any road or building, lie a hat, a carrot, 5 pieces of coal, and a scarf. Nobody placed them there. Nobody dropped them. Nobody forgot them. They are not leftovers from a party or remnants of a crime scene. They are simply there, arranged in a loose grouping on the grass, as if they had been gently set down by someone who no longer exists. How did they get there? This puzzle works differently from the first two. The man in the elevator and the surgeon's son both hinge on a single hidden assumption that, once identified, makes the answer click into place. The coal, the carrot, and the scarf hinge on a different kind of blindness. The assumption that the world you are looking at is the world as it has always been. You see a field in its current state, green and dry and open, and you ask yourself what event could have placed these objects here. You imagine a person carrying them, perhaps a child with a costume, perhaps a traveler who dropped their bag. You construct narratives of arrival and departure, of human intention and accident. The answer is that they are the remains of a snowman. The snowman melted. The objects that decorated it, the coal for its eyes and buttons, the carrot for its nose, the scarf around its neck, the hat on its head, did not melt. They simply settled onto the grass as the snow disappeared, leaving behind a portrait of absence, a negative space in the shape of something that was briefly, joyfully alive, and is now nothing but water soaking into the earth. The beauty of this puzzle, and it does have beauty, is that the answer carries an emotional weight that the question does not prepare you for. You expect a logical solution, a mechanical explanation, and what you get instead is a small, perfect image of impermanence, a thing that was built, that had a face and a name and maybe even a personality in the minds of the children who made it, and then it was gone. Undone not by violence or neglect, but by the simple, patient warmth of the sun. The coal, the carrot, and the scarf are not clues in a mystery. They are a memorial. the only evidence that something existed and was loved and could not last. If you are still awake, let that image dissolve the way the snowman dissolved, slowly and without drama, the details softening until only the feeling remains. And then consider one final puzzle, the darkest of the four, the one that sits in the mind like a stone at the bottom of a well. Deep in the forest, far from any town, stands a small cabin. The door is closed, the windows are intact. No tracks lead to or from the cabin in any direction. The snow around it is smooth and undisturbed. Inside the cabin are two people. Both are dead. What happened? Your mind goes to work immediately. Murder, you think, or suicide, or some terrible accident. Carbon monoxide from a faulty heater, a gas leak, poisoned food. Your imagination populates the cabin with furniture and details, gives the dead people faces and histories and reasons for being in the forest. You wonder who they were, how they knew each other, what brought them to this remote place. You construct a crime scene and begin looking for the murderer, and you realize that there are no footprints in the snow, which means no one entered or left the cabin after the last snowfall, which means either the killer is still inside, somehow hidden, or there was no killer at all, and you are back to accident or suicide, but you do not know the cause, and the puzzle sits there, sealed and silent, refusing to open. The answer is that the cabin is not a cabin. It is the cabin of an aeroplane. The two dead people are the pilots. The plane crashed in the forest, and what you have been imagining as a log house with a fireplace and curtains is actually a cockpit buried in snow, its instruments dark, its windscreen cracked, two people in their seats who did not survive the impact. The word cabin did all the work. When you heard cabin in the woods, you built a wooden house in your mind, because that is what cabin means in the context of a forest. You did not consider that cabin has another meaning, a perfectly common meaning, one you use every time you board an aeroplane without thinking about it. The puzzle exploited not a gap in your knowledge, but a gap in your attention. The moment when a word with multiple meanings was presented in a context that activated one meaning and suppressed the other. Your mind chose an interpretation, committed to it, and then could not find its way back, because the interpretation felt so natural that you did not recognize it as a choice. All four of these puzzles share a common ancestor, the realization, which is at once humbling and liberating, that the biggest obstacles to understanding are not out there in the world, but in here, in the machinery of perception and assumption that runs constantly and invisibly beneath your conscious thought. The short man, the female surgeon, the melted snowman, the crashed aeroplane, none of them require intelligence to solve. They require something rarer and more difficult, the willingness to notice what you are thinking, and to wonder whether you are thinking it because it is true or because it is familiar. Lateral thinking riddles are not fair, and they know it, and they do not care. A logic puzzle plays by rules that are stated up front, and if you are clever enough, you can always find the solution through pure reasoning. A lateral thinking riddle plays by rules that are unstated, rules that exist only in the gap between the puzzle's words and your interpretation of them. And the solution comes not from being cleverer, but from being less certain, less committed to your first impression, less willing to trust the picture your mind paints before you have checked whether all the paint is the right color. They are puzzles for the ego, really. They reward not brilliance but flexibility, not knowledge but doubt. And doubt, whatever its reputation, is the most useful intellectual tool a person can carry, lighter than logic, sharper than certainty, and infinitely more portable. You can take doubt anywhere. You can apply it to anything. And on a night like this, when the questions are winding down and the darkness is thickening around you like wool, doubt is the kindest companion you could ask for, because doubt does not demand answers. Doubt only asks you to stay curious a little longer, to hold the question open, to resist the urge to snap it shut. The room where nobody spoke is not empty. It is full of the things you assumed were there and the things that actually were, and the difference between those two sets of things is where every interesting thought you have ever had was born. Born between the assumed and the actual, between the world you expect and the world you get. That is where philosophy lives too. Though philosophy has never been content to leave the gap as a curiosity or a party trick. Philosophy wants to move into that gap, furnish it, raise children in it. Philosophy wants to know what the gap is made of, whether it has edges, whether it can be closed, or whether closing it would be the worst thing we could possibly do. And the puzzles that philosophy produces are not puzzles in the way the others have been, not problems with solutions, not riddles with answers, but something closer to wounds that will not heal, questions that have been asked for decades or centuries, and that remain, after all that time, exactly as open and exactly as painful as the day they were first posed. These are thought experiments, and they are the sharpest tools in philosophy's workshop. A thought experiment strips a moral or metaphysical question down to its essential structure, removing all the complicating details of real life, all the noise and context and ambiguity, until what remains is a clean, stark scenario that forces you to confront a single issue with nowhere to hide. They are not meant to be realistic. They are meant to be revealing, the way an X-ray is revealing. It does not show you what a person looks like, but it shows you where the bones are, and sometimes it shows you where the bones are broken. We begin with a trolley, because everything in modern moral philosophy begins, eventually, with a trolley. The year was 1967, and Philippa Foot, a British philosopher working at Oxford, was thinking about the doctrine of double effect, a principle from Catholic moral theology that draws a distinction between harm you intend and harm you merely foresee as a side effect of your actions. The principle was centuries old and had been debated in theology departments for generations, but Foot wanted to drag it out of the seminary and into the light of secular philosophical analysis. To do this, she needed an example so stripped of religious context, so bare and mechanical, that it could be examined on purely moral grounds. She imagined a trolley. A runaway trolley is hurtling down a track. Ahead, tied to the rails, are 5 people who will be killed if the trolley continues on its current path. You are standing beside a lever that will divert the trolley onto a side track where only 1 person is tied. If you pull the lever, the trolley will switch tracks, killing the 1 person but saving the 5. If you do nothing, the 5 will die. What do you do? Most people, when presented with this scenario, say they would pull the lever. The arithmetic seems straightforward. 1 death is better than 5. You are not killing the 1 person on the side track. You are redirecting a threat that already exists, and the 1 person's death, while regrettable, is a side effect of saving 5 lives. The logic feels clean, almost obvious. Then Foot's colleague, Judith Jarvis Thomson, an American philosopher at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, offered a variation in 1976 that made the clean logic collapse. Same trolley. Same 5 people on the track. But this time, you are standing on a bridge above the tracks, and beside you is a very large man. The only way to stop the trolley is to push this man off the bridge onto the tracks below. His body will stop the trolley, saving the 5 people, but he will die. The arithmetic is identical. 1 death to save 5. Do you push him? Most people say no. They recoil from the idea with a visceral horror that no amount of utilitarian calculation can overcome. Pushing a man to his death feels categorically different from pulling a lever, even though the outcome, 1 dead, 5 saved, is exactly the same. The numbers have not changed. The result has not changed. What has changed is the nature of your involvement. Pulling a lever is impersonal, mechanical, a redirection of forces already in motion. Pushing a man is intimate, physical, an act of violence against a specific human being whose face you can see, whose body you must touch, whose death is not a side effect but the means by which the five are saved. You are using him as a tool, a human speed bump, and something in the moral architecture of your mind will not permit it. The trolley problem, as it came to be called, split moral philosophy in two. Utilitarians, who believe that the right action is the one that produces the greatest good for the greatest number, argued that you should push the man, that refusing to do so is a sentimental failure to take the mathematics of suffering seriously. Deontologists, who believe that certain actions are inherently right or wrong regardless of their consequences, argued that pushing a man to his death violates his rights as a person and cannot be justified even if it saves a greater number. Both sides produced elaborate arguments, variations, and counterexamples. The trolley was given brakes and curves and additional tracks. The people on the tracks were given identities, ages, professions, criminal records. The large man was replaced with a trapdoor, a remote-controlled device, a self-sacrificing volunteer. Each variation was designed to tease apart the moral intuitions that the original scenario had tangled together, and each variation produced new disagreements and new puzzles. Decades later, the trolley problem remains unsolved. Not because philosophers are not clever enough to solve it, but because it exposes a genuine fracture in human moral reasoning, a place where two deeply held intuitions, the intuition that saving more lives is better, and the intuition that killing an innocent person is wrong, come into direct conflict, and neither will yield. The fracture is not in the problem. The fracture is in us. The trolley did not create the contradiction. It revealed it, the way a stress test reveals a crack in a bridge that was always there but never visible under normal conditions. Let the trolley roll on. Let the lever rust. Let the 5 people and the 1 person and the large man on the bridge all stand down from their terrible posts. We are moving now from a question about what you should do to a question about how you should think, and this next puzzle is stranger, quieter, and far more unsettling than anything involving a runaway train. In 1960, a philosopher and physicist named William Newcomb, working at the University of California's Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, devised a problem so confounding that when the Harvard philosopher Robert Nozick published it in 1969, he reported that almost everyone he showed it to felt certain of their answer, and almost everyone was split roughly evenly on what that answer was. People who disagreed could not understand how the other side could possibly believe what they believed. Friendships were strained. Arguments lasted hours. The problem became known as Newcomb's paradox. Here is the setup. Before you are 2 boxes. Box A is transparent. You can see that it contains $1,000. Box B is opaque. You cannot see what is inside. You are given 2 choices. Take both boxes or take only box B. Before you entered the room, a being of extraordinary predictive power, call it the predictor, analyzed your psychology, your history, your decision-making patterns, and made a prediction about what you would choose. If the predictor predicted you would take only box B, it placed $1 million inside box B. If it predicted you would take both boxes, it left box B empty. The predictor has done this thousands of times before and has never been wrong. What do you do? The argument for taking both boxes is straightforward. The predictor has already made its prediction. The money is either in box B or it is not. Your choice now cannot change what is already inside. Whatever is in the boxes is in the boxes. Taking both gives you everything that is there. Taking only box B gives you less. By every principle of rational decision-making, you should take both boxes. This is the dominance argument. Regardless of what the predictor did, you are better off taking both. The argument for taking only box B is equally straightforward. The predictor has never been wrong. Every person who has taken both boxes has walked away with $1,000 and an empty box B. Every person who has taken only box B has walked away with $1 million. The evidence is overwhelming. The expected payoff of taking only box B is $1 million. The expected payoff of taking both is $1,000. You should take only box B. This is the expected utility argument. You should choose the option with the highest expected return. Both arguments are logically valid. Both are supported by impeccable reasoning within their respective frameworks, and they produce opposite answers. The dominance argument says, take both. The expected utility argument says, take only one. You cannot do both. You must choose, and whichever you choose, the other argument will haunt you, whispering that you made a terrible mistake. Newcomb's paradox endures because it sits at the intersection of two fundamental principles of rational choice that, in normal circumstances, always agree. Dominance and expected utility usually point in the same direction. Newcomb's paradox is the one scenario where they diverge, and because neither principle can be dismissed without abandoning a core commitment of rational thought, the paradox functions as a kind of philosophical black hole, a point where the normal laws of reasoning break down and no one can agree on what replaces them. Nozick himself could not decide. He confessed in his original paper that he kept changing his mind, that each argument seemed convincing until he considered the other. He was not alone. Nearly 6 decades later, the philosophical community remains divided, and the division does not follow any predictable line. Brilliant people fall on both sides, and neither side can quite believe that the other side exists. Let that paradox dissolve into the dark. Do not try to solve it. Nobody has. Let the two boxes sit side by side in your imagination, one transparent and one opaque, and let the predictor, whoever or whatever it is, keep its silence. Now consider a different kind of machine, one that offers you not money but something far more valuable and far more dangerous. In 1974, the same Robert Nozick, who had popularized Newcomb's paradox, proposed another thought experiment in his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia. He called it the experience machine. Imagine that scientists have developed a device that can simulate any experience you desire. You can program it to give you the experience of writing a great novel, climbing a mountain, falling in love, raising children, winning a championship, traveling the world, or doing anything else you can imagine. While connected to the machine, you will have no awareness that the experiences are simulated. They will feel completely real, indistinguishable from genuine experience in every way. Your brain will register the same emotions, the same sensations, the same memories. You will be, from your own perspective, living the richest and most fulfilling life imaginable. The question is, would you plug in? If happiness is all that matters, if the quality of your subjective experience is the only thing that has value, then the answer should be an obvious yes. The machine offers more happiness, more pleasure, more satisfaction than real life could ever provide. No disappointment, no failure, no boredom, no loss. Just an unbroken stream of the best experiences a human mind can have, tailored precisely to your desires, running for as long as you live. And yet, most people say no. When Nozick first posed the question, and in the decades of surveys and studies that have followed, the majority of respondents refuse the machine. They want to actually do things, not merely have the experience of doing them. They want to be a certain kind of person, not merely feel like one. They want to live in reality, even if reality is harder, duller, and more painful than the alternative. Nozick used this intuition to argue against hedonism, the philosophical position that pleasure is the only intrinsic good. If hedonism were true, he reasoned, we should all want to plug in because the machine maximizes pleasure. The fact that most of us do not want to plug in suggests that we value something beyond pleasure, authenticity, agency, contact with reality. The knowledge that our achievements are real even when they are small, and our suffering is genuine even when it is pointless. But the thought experiment is slipperier than it first appears. If you refuse the machine, ask yourself why. Is it because you value reality, or because you are afraid of the machine? Is it because you believe that real experiences have a quality that simulated ones lack, or because the idea of simulation makes you uncomfortable in a way you cannot quite articulate? And what about the people already plugged in, people who by definition cannot know they are plugged in, who believe their experiences are real and whose happiness is genuine, at least from the inside? Are they worse off than you? By what measure? Who is the judge? The person inside the machine who is blissfully happy, or the person outside who can see the wires? The experience machine is a question about what you value when you strip away everything except the value itself. It is a mirror held up to your deepest commitments, and what it reflects is not always flattering. You say you value truth over pleasure, reality over comfort, but do you? Really? Have you not, at some point in your life, chosen a comfortable illusion over an uncomfortable truth, a soothing story over a hard fact, a version of yourself that you preferred to the version that actually exists? The machine is extreme, yes, but it is only a purified version of the choices you make every day, the small acts of self-deception and selective attention that make life bearable. The question is not whether you would plug in. The question is whether you already have. Let the machine power down. Let the wires retract. Come back to the surface of your own experience, whatever that experience is, wherever it is happening, and breathe. We have 2 more rooms to visit, and they are smaller, quieter, and stranger than any we have entered so far. In 1982, the philosopher Frank Jackson, working at Monash University in Australia, imagined a woman named Mary. Mary is a brilliant scientist. She knows everything there is to know about color vision, the wavelengths of light, the structure of the eye, the neurological processes that occur when a person perceives red or blue or green. She knows which wavelengths stimulate which cones in the retina, which neural pathways carry the signal to the brain, which regions of the cortex process the information. Her knowledge is complete. She understands the physics, the biology, the neuroscience, every objective fact about color that science has ever discovered or ever could discover. But Mary has lived her entire life in a black and white room. She has never seen color. She has studied it exhaustively, from textbooks and black and white monitors, but she has never experienced it. She knows what happens in a brain when it processes the wavelength of 620 nanometers. She does not know what it is like to see red. One day, Mary is released from her room. She steps outside and sees a red rose for the first time. Does she learn something new? If the answer is yes, if Mary, despite knowing every physical fact about color, learns something new when she sees red for the first time, then there are facts about consciousness that cannot be captured by physical descriptions. Subjective experience, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the taste of coffee on your tongue, has a quality that exists beyond the reach of science, not because science is not clever enough to find it, but because it is not the kind of thing that science, which deals in objective, third-person descriptions, is equipped to describe. Jackson called these qualities qualia, and the argument that they pose a problem for physicalism, the view that everything is ultimately physical, became known as the knowledge argument. If the answer is no, if Mary learns nothing new because her complete physical knowledge already encompasses everything there is to know about seeing red, then consciousness is, in principle, fully explicable in physical terms, and the sense that there is something it is like to see red, something over and above the neurological activity, is an illusion, a trick of introspection, a ghost in the machine that vanishes when you look at it closely enough. The debate over Mary's room has produced thousands of pages of philosophical argument and shows no sign of resolution. Some philosophers argue that Mary does learn something new, but that what she learns is not a new fact, but a new ability. The ability to recognize red, to imagine red, to remember red, which is a skill rather than a piece of knowledge. Others argue that the thought experiment is misleading because no one could actually know every physical fact about color. The scenario is impossible, and impossible scenarios cannot generate reliable intuitions. Others accept Jackson's original conclusion and embrace dualism, the view that mind and matter are fundamentally different kinds of thing. Jackson himself eventually changed his mind. In the years following the publication of Mary's Room, he came to reject the knowledge argument and embrace physicalism, arguing that Mary's surprise upon seeing red does not prove the existence of non-physical facts, but rather reveals a limitation in how we imagine what it would be like to know everything about color without having experienced to it. The father of the thought experiment disowned his own child, and the child, indifferent to its father's opinions, continued to grow and to trouble philosophers who picked it up. Mary's Room is a puzzle about the limits of knowledge, about whether understanding everything about a thing is the same as knowing what it is like to experience that thing. It is a question that touches not just philosophy of mind, but medicine, artificial intelligence, the ethics of empathy, and the deepest assumptions we make about what it means to understand another person. When you say you understand someone's pain, do you mean you know the neuroscience of pain, or do you mean you have felt something similar? And if you have never felt it, if you have lived your whole life in a room without it, can you understand it at all? Let Mary see her red rose. Let her stand in the garden with the sun on her face and the color flooding in, and let us not ask her what she learned, because the answer, whatever it is, will start another argument, and the night is getting late. One more room. The last room. The strangest room of all. In 1980, the philosopher John Searle at the University of California, Berkeley, imagined himself locked in a room. The room contained stacks of paper covered in Chinese characters and a detailed rule book written in English. Through a slot in the door, someone feeds in a piece of paper with Chinese characters on it, a question written in Chinese. Searle does not speak, read, or understand Chinese, but he can follow the rule book, which tells him, in English, exactly which Chinese characters to select from his stacks and in which order to slide them back through the slot. The rules are so comprehensive, so perfectly designed, that the responses he produces are indistinguishable from those of a native Chinese speaker. The person on the other side of the door believes they are having a conversation with someone who understands Chinese. But Searle, inside the room, does not understand a word of it. He is manipulating symbols according to rules. He does not know what the questions mean. He does not know what his answers mean. He is, in his own words, just shuffling paper. He has syntax, the formal rules for arranging symbols, but no semantics, no grasp of meaning or content. He is processing Chinese without understanding it. Searle designed the Chinese room as an argument against strong artificial intelligence. The claim that a computer running the right program could genuinely understand, genuinely think, genuinely be conscious. His point was simple and devastating. If a human being in a room can follow the same rules that a computer follows and produce the same outputs, and the human being clearly does not understand Chinese, then the computer does not understand Chinese either. Computation alone, no matter how sophisticated, does not produce understanding. Something more is needed, something that rules and symbol manipulation cannot provide. The argument provoked a firestorm that has not died down in nearly half a century. Computer scientists, cognitive scientists, and philosophers of mind attacked it from every angle. Some argued that while Searle himself does not understand Chinese, the system as a whole, Searle plus the rule book plus the room, does understand the way a brain understands, even though no individual neuron understands. Searle replied that he could memorize the rule book and internalize the whole system, and he still would not understand Chinese. He would just be doing the same thing faster, without the physical room. Others argued that the Chinese room is misleading because real artificial intelligence would not work by following a static rulebook, but by learning from experience, adapting its responses, and developing internal representations that function like understanding, even if they are not identical to human understanding. Searle replied that none of this matters, because the fundamental point stands: formal symbol manipulation is not sufficient for semantics, and no amount of additional complexity changes formal manipulation into genuine comprehension. The Chinese room sits at the heart of the most important question in the philosophy of mind and in the future of technology. Can a machine think? Not simulate thinking, not produce outputs that look like thinking, but actually genuinely think, with understanding, with awareness, with something it is like to be the machine? Searle says no. Many of his critics say yes, or at least not yet, but in principle. And the argument continues year after year, paper after paper, conference after conference, with no resolution in sight, because the question is not really about machines at all. It is about what we mean by understanding, what we mean by mind, what we mean when we say that the lights are on and somebody is home. And those questions, the deepest questions about consciousness and meaning and the nature of inner life, are not the kind of questions that have answers. They are the kind of questions that have better and better ways of being asked. Let the Chinese room close its slot. Let Searle put down his rulebook and sit in the quiet. Let the paper settle on the floor, covered in characters that mean everything to someone and nothing to the man who arranged them. 5 mirrors, 5 reflections, and every one of them shows a different face. The trolley asks what you would do. The predictor asks how you would choose. The machine asks what you value. Mary asks what you know. And the room, the quiet room with its stacks of symbols and its slot in the door, asks the question that contains all the others. What does it mean to understand? You are lying in the dark, or something very like the dark, and these questions are lying beside you, patient and warm and utterly unresolved. They do not need answers tonight. They have survived decades without answers. They will survive this night too. And tomorrow, if you remember them at all, they will be a little different, shaped by whatever dreams pass through you between now and morning, worn smooth by sleep, the way stones are worn smooth by water. Water over stones. That is what thinking sounds like when you have been doing it long enough, when the questions have been turning in your mind for hours, and the edges have softened, and the sharp distinctions between one puzzle and the next have started to blur. You have traveled a long way tonight, from the hillside outside Thebes to a room full of Chinese characters, from a farmer's boat on an unnamed river to a hotel with infinitely many rooms. And the questions you have carried with you have not become lighter, they have become quieter. That is not the same thing. A heavy thing can be quiet. A stone at the bottom of a river is both heavy and silent, and the water moves over it without effort, and the stone does not mind. We have arrived at the last room, the room where the candle is burning low and the puzzles are not puzzles anymore, not exactly. They are open wounds in the body of reason, places where logic turns back on itself and bites its own tail, where the rules of rational thought produce answers that contradict the rules of rational thought, where the best minds in the history of philosophy and mathematics have looked at a problem and said, honestly, and without embarrassment, I do not know. These are the unsolvable riddles, the ones that have no agreed-upon answers, the ones that may never have agreed-upon answers, and they are, for that reason, the most beautiful of all. Begin with a raven. In 1945, the German philosopher Carl Gustav Hempel, who had fled Nazi Germany and was working at universities in the United States, published a paper that contained what he called the paradox of confirmation. It became known as the Raven paradox, and it begins with a statement so simple that it seems immune to controversy. All ravens are black. How would you confirm this statement? The obvious approach is to go out and observe ravens. Every black raven you find provides a small piece of evidence in favor of the claim. No single observation can prove the statement true, since you can never observe every raven that has ever existed or ever will exist, but each black raven you encounter makes the claim a little more probable. This is the basic logic of inductive reasoning, the process by which science builds general laws from particular observations, and it is so fundamental to how we understand the world that questioning it feels almost perverse. But Hempel noticed something troubling. The statement, "all ravens are black," is logically equivalent to its contrapositive, "all non-black things are non-ravens." This is not a matter of opinion. It is a law of logic, as certain as anything in mathematics. If all ravens are black, then anything that is not black is not a raven. The two statements say exactly the same thing in different words. Now, if observing a black raven confirms the statement all ravens are black, then by the same logic, observing a non-black non-raven should confirm the equivalent statement all non-black things are non-ravens, and therefore should also confirm all ravens are black. A red apple is a non-black non-raven. So observing a red apple should provide evidence that all ravens are black. A white shoe is a non-black non-raven. So observing a white shoe should confirm it too. By this reasoning, you can stay in your kitchen, look at the objects on your counter, and gradually accumulate evidence about the color of ravens without ever seeing one. This is absurd. Everyone agrees it is absurd. But the logic is valid. Each step follows from the previous one by rules of inference that no one disputes. The conclusion is ridiculous, but the argument is sound, and that combination, a sound argument leading to a ridiculous conclusion, is the definition of a paradox. Philosophers have spent 80 years trying to resolve the raven paradox, and while several promising approaches exist, none has achieved universal acceptance. Some argue that the red apple does confirm the raven hypothesis, but by such a vanishingly small amount that the confirmation is practically zero, because the class of non-black things is enormously larger than the class of ravens, and each observation contributes evidence in proportion to the size of the class it samples from. Others argue that the paradox exposes a flaw in the standard theory of confirmation, that the rules of inductive reasoning need to be revised to account for background knowledge and relevance. Others argue that the logical equivalence between a statement and its contrapositive does not entail equivalence of evidential support, that logic and evidence obey different rules. The raven paradox matters because it strikes at the foundation of empirical reasoning. If the simple act of confirming a universal statement produces absurdities, then something is wrong with our understanding of how evidence works. And if something is wrong with our understanding of how evidence works, then the entire structure of scientific reasoning is standing on shakier ground than we thought. The paradox does not disprove science. It asks science to explain itself more carefully, and science so far has not entirely managed it. Let the raven fly. Let the apple sit on the counter. Let the paradox do its quiet work, turning like a key in a lock that may or may not lead anywhere. Now imagine falling asleep. Not the way you are falling asleep now, slowly and gently, with questions settling around you like blankets, but suddenly, in the middle of an experiment, in a room where your sleep has been arranged by philosophers who want to use your unconscious mind to settle an argument. The Sleeping Beauty problem was first published by the philosopher Adam Elga in 2000, though versions of it had circulated informally for years before that. It goes like this. On Sunday, Sleeping Beauty agrees to participate in an experiment. She is told the full details of the procedure in advance. The experimenters will put her to sleep on Sunday night. Then they will flip a fair coin. If the coin lands heads, they will wake her once, on Monday, and the experiment will end. If the coin lands tails, they will wake her on Monday, put her back to sleep, Erase her memory of the Monday waking so she has no recollection of it, and then wake her again on Tuesday. When she is woken, she will not know what day it is or whether she has been woken before. Each time she is woken, she will be asked a single question. What is your credence that the coin landed heads? In other words, what probability do you assign to heads? The halfer position says the answer is 1/2. The coin is fair. It was flipped once. The probability of heads is 1 in 2. Nothing that happens after the flip can change the objective probability of the flip itself. Sleeping Beauty knew the coin was fair before she went to sleep, and she has received no new information upon waking, because she knew in advance that she would be woken regardless of the result. Her credence in heads should remain at 1/2. The thirder position says the answer is 1/3. From Sleeping Beauty's perspective upon waking, she is in one of 3 equally possible situations. It is Monday and the coin was heads, it is Monday and the coin was tails, or it is Tuesday and the coin was tails. She cannot distinguish between these 3 situations. Each is equally compatible with her experience. Since only one of the 3 corresponds to heads, her credence in heads should be 1/3. Both positions are defended by serious philosophers and mathematicians. Both have been subjected to rigorous analysis. Both produce compelling arguments. And they cannot both be right, because 1/2 and 1/3 are different numbers, and the question asks for a single number. The Sleeping Beauty problem is maddening, because it seems like it should be easy. A fair coin. A simple question about probability. How can there be disagreement? And yet the disagreement is deep and genuine, rooted in fundamentally different views about what probability means, about whether credence should track the objective chance of an event or the subjective experience of the observer, about whether the act of erasing memory and creating additional wakings changes the evidential landscape, even though it provides no new information in the traditional sense. Some philosophers have argued that the disagreement cannot be resolved because the 2 sides are not really disagreeing about the same thing, that halfers and thirders are using the word probability to mean different things, and the puzzle is not a paradox at all, but a disambiguation problem. Others argue that the disagreement is genuine and that one side must be wrong, though they cannot agree on which side. Let Sleeping Beauty rest. She has had a long experiment, and she deserves her sleep more than most. Now wake up, briefly, for a hanging. A judge tells a condemned prisoner on Saturday that he will be hanged on one day of the following week, Monday through Friday, and that the hanging will come as a surprise. The prisoner will not know the day of his execution until the executioner arrives at his cell door that morning. The prisoner, who is a logician, or perhaps who simply thinks too much, begins to reason. The hanging cannot take place on Friday, because if he is still alive on Thursday evening, he will know that Friday is the only remaining day, and the hanging will not be a surprise. So Friday is eliminated. But if Friday is eliminated, then the hanging cannot take place on Thursday either, because if he is still alive on Wednesday evening, he will know that Thursday is the only remaining day, since Friday has been ruled out. So Thursday is eliminated. By the same reasoning, Wednesday is eliminated, then Tuesday, then Monday. The prisoner concludes, with evident satisfaction, that the hanging cannot take place at all, because on no day can it be a surprise. On Wednesday morning, the executioner arrives. The prisoner is surprised. The unexpected hanging paradox, which has been discussed in various forms since at least the 1940s, is a puzzle about the limits of self-referential reasoning. The prisoner's logic is valid at each step, and yet the conclusion is false because the hanging does happen and it is a surprise. The error, if there is one, is subtle and has been the subject of extensive philosophical debate. Some argue that the prisoner's reasoning is circular, that he uses the conclusion, the hanging cannot happen, as a premise in the very argument that generates it. Others argue that the paradox exposes a fundamental problem with the concept of surprise, which is a psychological state that depends on expectations, which depend on reasoning, which can undermine itself. The beauty of the unexpected hanging is that it feels like a magic trick. The prisoner reasons himself out of danger, and then danger arrives anyway, and you cannot quite see where the trick was performed. The logic was airtight. The conclusion was certain. And then reality, indifferent to logic, did what it was always going to do. Now, one final puzzle. The last one. The hardest. In 1996, the logician George Boulos, a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, published a paper with the title, "The Hardest Logic Puzzle Ever." He attributed the puzzle to the logician Raymond Smullyan, who had spent a career designing increasingly diabolical logic problems, and to the earlier work of the mathematician and computer scientist John McCarthy. The puzzle is this. 3 gods, named A, B, and C, stand before you. One always tells the truth. One always lies. One answers randomly, sometimes truthfully and sometimes falsely, with no pattern or predictability. You know that these 3 roles exist, but you do not know which god plays which role. You may ask 3 yes or no questions, each addressed to a single god of your choosing. Your task is to determine which god is which. The complication, beyond the obvious difficulty, is that the gods answer in their own language. They say da or ja, and you know that one of these words means yes and the other means no, but you do not know which is which. So when a god says da, you do not know whether it means yes or no, and you must factor this ambiguity into your questions. Boulos provided a solution, and it is, as you might expect, extraordinarily intricate. The first question must be designed to identify a god who is not the random one, because the random god is immune to logical analysis. You cannot deduce anything from its answers, since they follow no pattern. Once you have identified a non-random god, you can use your remaining 2 questions to determine the roles of the other 2. The questions themselves must be constructed using the same technique as the 2 gods puzzle, embedding one question inside another to neutralize the ambiguity of the god's language, asking things like, if I asked you whether you are the truth teller, would you say, da? The full solution requires a level of logical precision that borders on the artistic, each question balanced and self-referencing, each answer decoded through layers of inference. Boulos himself remarked that the puzzle was so hard that he was not certain most professional logicians could solve it without assistance, and he published the solution alongside the puzzle, which is the logician's equivalent of admitting that the mountain is too steep to climb without a map. The hardest logic puzzle ever sits at the summit of a tradition that stretches back through every puzzle we have visited tonight. From the Sphinx's riddle on the road to Thebes to the 2 guards at their doors, from Alcuin's farmer and his troublesome goat to the infinite corridors of Hilbert's hotel, it is the tradition of asking questions that are harder than they look, of constructing small, perfect worlds where the rules are clear and the solutions are hidden, and the only tool you have is your own capacity to think. And now, the thinking can stop. Not because the questions have been answered. They have not. The Raven paradox is still circling. Sleeping Beauty is still uncertain. The prisoner is still surprised. The 3 gods are still standing in a row, saying da and ja, and nobody is sure what they mean. The questions are exactly where you found them, open and patient and unanswered. And they will be here in the morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. The candle in the window is burning low now. You can see its light through your closed eyelids, or perhaps you are imagining it, which amounts to the same thing at this hour. The flame is small and steady, and it does not flicker, because there is no wind in this room, no draft, no disturbance. Just the quiet hum of a mind slowing down, the long exhalation of a brain that has been working hard and is now finally being given permission to rest. Think of all the rooms you have passed through tonight. The hillside where the Sphinx waited, The wedding feast where Samson smiled? The monastery where a monk wrote riddles about onions and moths? The room with 2 doors and 2 guards? The prison cells where 2 strangers decided whether to trust each other? The game show stage with its 3 doors and its smiling host? The river crossing where the farmer brought his wolf and goat and cabbage? The bridge where 4 people shared a single torch? The room where a man pushed symbols through a slot without knowing what they meant? Each room was different. Each room asked something different of you. And in each room, the answer was either simpler than you expected, stranger than you expected, or entirely absent, a blank space where the answer should have been, shaped like a question mark and warm to the touch. The riddles are not going anywhere. They have survived for centuries, some of them for millennia, passed from hand to hand like coins, worn smooth by use but never diminished, never spent. The Sphinx asked her riddle 3,000 years ago, and it is still being asked today. Zeno proposed his paradoxes 2,500 years ago, and they are still being argued about. The farmer has been crossing his river for 1,200 years. Newcomb's predictor has been sealing its boxes for 60. And the gods, the 3 gods with their da and their ja, have been standing in a row for 30, patient and silent, and waiting for someone clever enough to ask the right 3 questions. You do not need to be that person tonight. Tonight you are the listener, the one who hears the questions and lets them settle, the one who holds the riddles without solving them, the way you might hold a smooth stone in your palm without throwing it, feeling its weight and its warmth and its perfect uselessness. The candle is very low now. The wick is almost gone. In a few moments, it will gutter and die, and the room will be dark, and the puzzles will still be there, invisible in the darkness, patient as they have always been patient, waiting as they have always waited. And you will be asleep, or very nearly, drifting in the space between questions, where the mind does its strangest and most beautiful work, connecting things that should not be connected, seeing patterns that the waking mind would dismiss, dreaming in a language that has no grammar and no dictionary and no need for either. Sleep now. The riddles will keep. They have been keeping for a very long time. They are good at it, better than you or I or anyone. The questions will be here when you wake, and they will be different, or you will be different. And either way, the conversation will continue, as it always has, as it always will, the oldest conversation in the world. The one that began around a fire in the deep past, when someone leaned forward and said, "What has a voice but no mouth? What runs but has no legs?" The fire is out. The voice is quiet. The legs are still. Sleep now. Good night.